Hey there, and welcome back. Settle yourself down, however you are lying tonight, and let the day go quiet and loose around you. This is one of those evenings made for stepping clean out of your own time and into another, far older and stranger and colder, for slipping back across 1,000 years and more into a long firelit hall on a frozen northern island. On the one night of the year when the people of that hall gathered close against the longest dark and feasted and remembered and were warm. It is for anyone who has ever wanted to know, not from a book, but from the inside, what it felt like to be alive in the dead of midwinter of the Viking Age. Gathered with the household around a long fire while the snow piled against the turf walls and the vast night pressed in. I would like to take you there tonight, to a chieftain's longhouse in Iceland at Yule, 1,000 years ago, on the night of the midwinter feast, and to sit you down on the bench by the fire and let the whole warm evening of it unfold around you until you drift away to sleep. Come with me if you are ready. Then let this century fall away and come back with me to a snowbound island in the cold northern sea, where a long low hall lies half buried in the drifts, and the smoke is rising from its roof. And within it the fire is lit, and the ale is poured, and the feast is beginning. Before we cross the snow to that doorway together, let me say the one small thing I always say. If you find tonight that you have been carried out of your own time and set down warm in another, then you might think of subscribing, so that these journeys can keep finding their way to you on the nights you need them, and so that more of these vanished worlds can be opened and walked through in the quiet. It costs you nothing, and it tells me which of these places are reaching people out there wherever you happen to be lying. I read the notes you leave, the towns and the countries you write from, and the late hours these tales reach you at, and I think often of the great scattered company of you, settling down to sleep all across the turning world, while a story of fire and snow unwinds in the dark. That is all I will ask. Now, let us go to the longhouse. Picture this: a white land under a low grey sky, somewhere in Iceland, more than 1,000 years ago, in the last light of the shortest days of the year. There is snow over everything, deep and unbroken, lying blue in the hollows and grey-white on the long slopes of the fells. And there is no other colour in all the world but the white of the snow and the dead of the bare rock where the wind has scoured it clean. The light is already failing, for the sun barely lifts above the hills at this season and is gone again within a few short hours, and the northern dusk is coming down over the frozen island. And there, ahead of you across the white field, low and long and half sunk into the earth, lies the hall. You would almost miss it, for it is built of turf and stone and roofed with turf, and the snow lies thick upon it, so that it seems less a building than a low long rise in the ground. A green and white whaleback humped against the hillside, but there is smoke rising from a hole in the ridge of its roof. Blue smoke standing straight up into the still cold air, and there is a faint glow of fire at its low doorway. And you know that within that humble mound of earth and turf there is warmth and light and the assembled life of a household waiting out the dark. Come with me toward it, over the snow, toward the smoke and the firelight, for the night is coming and the feast is laid. Let me tell you, as we cross the snow, where and when we are, for this is a place few people today know much about. And to feel it truly, you should understand the island and the age and the people whose hall we are about to enter. We are in Iceland, the cold island far out in the Northern Ocean, near the edge of the known world, and we are in the 10th century, in the high years of what later ages would call the Viking Age, when the Norse peoples of Scandinavia had spread out over the northern seas in their ships, raiding and trading and settling, from the British Isles to the rivers of the east to the very edge of the unknown west. Iceland itself was a new land then, newly peopled. Only a few generations before this night, it had been empty, a wild, uninhabited island of fire and ice and grass. And then the settlers had come, mostly from Norway, in their ships, with their families and their cattle and their household goods. to take new land and make new homes far from the kings and the crowding of the old country. They had filled the habitable edges of the island, the green coastal lands and the river valleys, with their farms, and they had made a society unlike any other in the Norselands, a country of free farmers with no king at all, governed by their own assembly and their own law, where a man standing rested on his land, his household, his kin, and above all his good name. The people whose hall we are entering are such people, the descendants of those settlers, free Icelandic farmers of the 10th century, proud and independent, and bound by a fierce code of honour and law and hospitality, living at the cold far edge of the world. And it is winter, deep winter, the hardest season of all in that hard land, when the days shrink to a few grey hours and the nights swell to swallow the rest, when the snow lies deep and the storms come howling off the sea, and all the world seems to draw in toward the small warm centres of the firelit halls. This is the season of Yule, the midwinter feast, the oldest and most important festival of the northern year, held at the turning of the dark. When the sun has sunk to its lowest and the nights are longest and the people gather to feast and drink and honour the gods and remember the dead and hold the bitter cold at bay with fire and company and plenty. There is no better night to visit such a hall than this one, the night of the Yule feast, and that is the night we have come to. Let us come up to the door now, out of the snow and the failing light, and go in. The way in is low and small. For warmth, a short entrance passage, cut through the thick turf wall, and you must bow your head to pass it, leaving the wind and the snow and the dying daylight behind you. And then you are through, and inside, and the hall opens out around you, long and low and warm and golden with firelight, and for a moment you can only stand and take it in. The sudden warmth on your cold face, the smell of it, the dim moving light, the murmur of many voices, the whole gathered world of the Longhouse on its feast night. Let your eyes find the shape of it, slowly, in the firelight. It is one room, far longer than it is wide, running away from you into the dim golden distance, with a high-arched roof of timber and turf overhead, dark with the smoke of years. Down the centre of the floor, the whole length of the room, runs the fire, not a single hearth, but a trench of fire. A line of burning logs and glowing embers laid along a stone-lined channel in the beaten earth floor, throwing its warmth and its restless golden light out over the hall. The smoke of it rises and drifts and gathers under the high roof, and finds its way out at last, through a hole left open in the ridge, the only opening to the sky, for there are no chimneys here, and few windows, if any. Only the fire and the smoke hole above it. Along both side walls, running the length of the hall, are raised platforms, wide benches of earth and timber, and on these the household sits and works and feasts and sleeps. For these benches are the furniture of the life of the hall. And the glow is firelight and lamplight, warm and golden and low, gathered close around the fire and fading into shadow at the edges and ends of the room, so that the hall is a place of warm bright centre and dim soft margins. The people drawn together into the light, the dark drawn back to the walls. It is warm, and it is close, and it is full of life after the white silence outside. There is the smell of woodsmoke and roasting food and ale and animals and the press of many people. The thick, rich smell of a hall full of the living on a feast night. There is the sound of voices, many voices, talk and low laughter, and the clatter of vessels, and somewhere the sound of the fire itself, the settling and crackling of the blaze. And there are the people, the whole household of the farm, gathered along the benches in the firelight. More of them than you would think such a place could hold, the master and his family, and his servants and his guests, all drawn in together for the feast of the year. This is the Longhouse, the heart of the Norse winter world, and tonight it is at its fullest and warmest and brightest, and we are inside it, out of the cold, for all of the long Yule evening. Let us look more closely now at this hall and the people in it, beginning with the fire that is its very heart. The fire is the heart of the hall, and everything else is arranged around it. So let us begin there, with the fire, for to understand the Longhouse, you must first understand its fire. It is not like the hearth of a later house, a fire set against a wall in a stone fireplace with a chimney to draw the smoke away. It is older and simpler and grander than that. It is a long line of fire laid down the very middle of the floor, the whole length of the hall, in a shallow stone-lined trench, and it burns there through all the winter season, day and night, never wholly out. The living centre of the household's whole world. The fire gives the hall its warmth first of all, and in that frozen land, the warmth of the hearth fire was the difference between life and death through the winter. The one source of heat in a world of snow and storm. It gives the hall its light, the restless golden firelight that fills the room and lights the faces and throws the shadows wavering up the walls and along the dim roof. It gives the household its cooking, for the food is made at the fire, the cauldrons hung over it, and the meat roasted beside it. And it gives the hall its centre, its gathering point, the line down the middle of the room about which the life of the household turns. The benches ranged along both sides of it, the people drawn in toward its light and heat. The smoke of it rises and hangs in a blue haze under the high roof and drifts out slowly through the opening at the ridge, and that drifting smoke and the soot of years black on the timbers above are the price of the open fire, but it is a price gladly paid, for the hearth fire is life itself in the northern winter. There is something very old and deep in the fire, something that reaches back far beyond the Norse, to the very first gathering of people around the first flames, against the first dark. To sit at the long fire in the Longhouse, with the entire household ranged around it and the snow piled against the walls outside, is to take part in one of the oldest human acts there is. The gathering of the people around the kept fire in the dark and cold of winter, and the heat of it goes deeper than the body. Let the firelight settle over you then, the long golden blaze down the centre of the hall, as we look now at the people gathered around it, the household of the farm. A farm household in 10th century Iceland was a numerous and a various company, far larger than the small families we know, and on a feast night like this one, the whole of it is gathered in the hall. So let me show you who they are. At the head of it all is the master of the farm, the bondi, the free farmer who owns the land and the hall and the herds, and who may be more than a mere farmer, for the greater among them were chieftains, the gore, men who held authority over the district, and a following of lesser men, and a voice in the law. He is the head of the household, the lord of the hall, and the feast is his, given in his hall to his people. Beside him is his wife, the husfreyja, the lady of the house, the mistress of the whole indoor world of the farm, and her authority within the hall is as real as his, of which we will speak more. Around them are their children, and very often other kin besides, for the household gathered in the wider family, and beyond the family the dependents, the free servants and labourers, who worked the farm for hire or for their keep. And below them, again, the thralls, the slaves, for this was a society that held slaves, the unfree, who did the hardest labour of the farm and the household. It is right to pause on that, the thralls, and not to look away from it, for it is part of the truth of this world, and a hard part. These were people held in bondage, the unfree taken in war or raid or born into slavery, who had no freedom and no standing, and who did the heaviest and meanest work of the farm. Their lives were hard, and their condition was a real and bitter injustice at the foundation of this society, and a true account of the Longhouse must hold that knowledge alongside the warmth and the firelight. The feast is warm and the hall is bright, but it rests, as the comfort of the few has so often rested through history, on the labour of the unfree as well as the free, and the thralls too are in the hall tonight. Serve their share of the feast, but unfree still. We carry that knowledge with us, quietly, as part of the whole truth of the place. But on this night at least, the household feasts together, free and unfree, family and servant, all drawn into the one warm hall for the feast of the year, ranged along the benches in the firelight, the numerous various company of a great northern farm, drawn in together against the winter. That is who fills the hall tonight. Now let us look at the man at the head of them, and the place where he sits, for the high seat of the hall is a matter worth understanding. Midway down one of the long side walls, facing the fire, is the high seat, the onvegi, the seat of honour, the place of the master of the hall. It is the most important place in the longhouse, raised a little or marked out from the common benches, and it is flanked by two carved wooden pillars. The high seat pillars, often beautifully worked with the images of the gods, or with twining patterns, the proudest furniture the hall possesses. From the high seat, the master presides over his hall and his feast, looking out over the fire and the ranged benches and all his gathered household, the lord of this small, warm world. And there is a story in those high seat pillars, a story that takes us back to the very settling of the island, for there was a custom told of the first settlers that catches at the imagination. When a settler came in his ship to take new land in Iceland, the tale goes, he would cast the carved pillars of his high seat overboard into the sea as he neared the coast, and let them drift where the gods and the currents would carry them. And wherever they came ashore, there he would make his home and raise his hall, taking the landing of the pillars as the sign of where he was meant to settle. Whether it happened so for every settler we cannot know, for the tales were written down long after, but the custom is remembered, and it tells you something true about these people, that they carried the heart of the old hall with them across the sea to the new land, the very pillars of the high seat, and let the gods choose where the new hall would rise. The high seat in the hall we are sitting in tonight may have such pillars, carried from Norway by an ancestor and set up here at the landing place. The heart of the hall brought across the ocean and planted in the new earth. There is a depth of meaning in that. The carried pillars, the chosen place, the hall raised where the old high seat came ashore, and it is good to know it as we look at the master in his seat of honour. Now, let us turn to the lady of the hall, the husfreyja. For in the Norse lands, the woman of the house was no small figure, and her authority was real and respected, and her work was the very keeping of the household's life. She is the mistress of the whole indoor world, the hall and the stores and the dairy and the work of the women, and the sign of her authority is the bunch of keys she carries at her belt. The keys to the chests and the storehouses where the wealth and the food and the precious things of the household are kept. To hold the keys was to hold real power, the management of the farm's whole substance, and the husfreyja held them, and ran the great establishment of the farm with a competence and an authority that the law and the custom of the people recognized and honored. Her realm above all was the work of cloth, for in that age the making of cloth was women's work, and it was endless and it was vital. The wool of the farm's own sheep was spun and woven, through the winter, into the woolen cloth that clothed the household and that served, in that land, as a very measure of wealth and a means of exchange, the homespun by which other things were valued and bought. The women of the hall worked at the great upright looms that stood against the walls, and at their spinning through all the dark indoor months, making the cloth that the household lived by, and the husfreyja oversaw it all. She was, in her own sphere, as much a ruler as her husband, in his, a full partner in the holding and running of the farm, and the Norse sagas are full of strong and formidable women, mistresses of their halls, whose will and word carried real weight. The lady of the hall we are feasting in tonight is such a woman, her keys at her belt, her looms against the wall, the mistress of the bright world within the turf walls. So now you know the hall and the fire and the people, the master in his high seat, and the lady with her keys, and the assembled household around the blaze. Come with me now to the reason they are all gathered tonight, the feast itself, and to the deep midwinter festival it belongs to, the festival of Yule. For to understand this night, you must understand what Yule was to these people. Yule was the midwinter feast of the northern winter, the oldest and the deepest of the festivals of the year, held at midwinter, at the turning of the dark, when the sun had sunk to its lowest and the days had shrunk to almost nothing, and the nights had grown to their longest. It was the festival of the dead heart of winter, the still point of the turning year, and it answered a need as old as the north itself. The need to make a great light and a great warmth and a gathering against the longest dark, to feast and drink and be together and hold off, with fire and company and plenty, the cold and the night that pressed in on every side. The very name is older than the Norse religion, older than the records, a word out of the deep northern past for the midwinter feast. And when in later ages the North became Christian, the new feast of Christmas was laid down over the old feast of Yule, and took its season and even its name, so that the word lives on in our own midwinter still. What exactly the people did at Yule in the pagan North, in the centuries before the new faith came, we know only in part, and much of what we are told comes from writers of a later Christian age, looking back. So we must hold it with some care, but the heart of it is clear enough. It was a feast, a great gathering, and feasting in the hall, with the best food and drink the household could provide, lasting not one night, but several. It was a time of the honouring of the gods, with solemn drinking of toasts, and the later writers tell us, with sacrifices for the good of the coming year, for peace and plenty and a kind season. And it was a time of the remembering of the dead, of the kinsmen and the ancestors gone before, who were honoured and toasted and held in memory at the turning of the year. Feast and gods and the remembered dead, all gathered into the one great festival against the midwinter dark. That is what Yule was, and that is the night we have come to, the night of the Yule feast in the Longhouse. And now that you know what it means, let us join it. Let me show you the feast. Before we sit to the feast, let me show you what it took to lay it. For a feast in the dead of an Icelandic winter did not appear by magic, and behind the laden boards of the Yule table stood the whole long labour of the year. In a land so hard and so far north, where little grew, and the winter was long and absolute, the gathering and keeping of food was the great work of life, the thing on which survival itself depended, and the Yule feast was, in a sense, the showing forth of a year's careful provision. For most of the year these people lived close to the edge of want, and the whole round of their labour was bent toward laying in enough to carry the household through the dead season, when nothing could be grown or gathered. Through the brief bright summer they had worked without rest, cutting and drying the hay that would keep the beasts alive through the winter, for the survival of the animals was the survival of the people. They had milked and made the dairy stores that were the foundation of their food, the butter and the cheeses and the soured milk and the skyr, the thick cultured milk that was a staple of the northern table. All of it put by in the cool storehouses against the winter. They had dried fish in the wind until it was hard as wood and would keep for years, the half-isker that was bread and meat to them both. They had gathered what the wild land gave, the berries and the eggs and the seabirds of the cliffs, the seaweed from the shore. And in the autumn, when the beasts that could not be kept through the winter were taken, they had laid in their meat, smoked and dried and salted and soured, stored against the dark months to come. All of it, the long labour of the year, was gathered and kept and counted and watched over, hoarded against the hunger of the winter, doled out carefully through the winter months so that it would last until the spring. And the Yule feast was the one great loosening of that careful hoarding, the night when the household ate, not sparingly but in abundance, when the best of the stores was brought out, and the boards were piled high, and the long anxious thrift of the winter was set aside for a few bright nights of plenty. There is a meaning in that worth feeling, The feast of abundance struck at the very darkest and hungriest point of the year. The deliberate plenty against the dark, the gathered wealth of a whole year's labour poured out in one great warm gathering. The feast was a defiance in its way of the cold and the want, a saying that even now, in the dead of the winter, the household could be fed and full and glad. Now let us sit to it and see what is on the board. The boards are laid along the benches before the seated household, and they are piled tonight with the best the farm can give, brought out from the stores for the feast. There is meat, roasted and boiled at the long fire, the good meat of the autumn brought out from where it was kept, more of it than the household sees at any other time of the year, the rich centre of the feast. There is fish, the dried fish softened, and the fresh fish, if the season and the sea allowed, for fish was a great part of the northern table. There is the dairy in abundance, the butter and the cheeses, and the bowls of thick skyr, sweetened perhaps with the precious hoarded berries, or a little costly honey. There is bread, where there was grain to make it, the flat, dense loaves of barley, though grain was scarce and dear in Iceland, and bread was less the staple there than in warmer lands. There is porridge and broth from the cauldrons over the fire, and there is whatever rare and precious things the household could command, the costly imported goods that a wealthy farmer might have got by trade across the sea, a luxury for the feast. It is brought and served and shared along the benches, the whole household eating together in the firelight, the master and his family and the servants and the rest, all fed from the one great feast. And after the long, careful winter thrift, the sheer abundance of it is a joy. The warm, laden boards, the rich food, the eating ones fill in the bright hall, while the snow lies deep outside. Feel the heat and the plenty of it, the firelit feast in the dead of winter, the household eating drawn close in the face of the dark. But a Norse feast was as much about the drinking as the eating, and it is to the drink that the evening truly turns. So let us speak of that, of the ale and the mead that flow at the Yule feast. The drink of the feast is ale, first of all, the ale brewed from barley, and at Yule the ale flowed as it did at no other time, for the brewing of ale was bound up with the very keeping of the feast. In a land where grain was scarce, ale was a precious thing, not the daily drink it was in richer countries, but a matter of feasts and gatherings. And to brew ale for Yule and to drink it freely was itself a mark of the feast, a loosening of the year's scarcity. The ale was brewed in quantity for the festival and poured out into the cups and the drinking horns and passed along the benches, and the drinking of it was a serious and a joyful business. Both, the strong ale going round in the firelight, loosening the tongues and warming the blood and drawing the household into the deep fellowship of the feast. And for the master and the honoured there was mead, the drink of honey, older and more prestigious even than ale, brewed from the precious imported honey and prized above all other drink. The drink of kings and gods in the old poems, the drink of Odin himself. To drink mead was to drink the noblest draught the North knew, and at a great feast the mead would be brought out and poured for the master and his guests, the golden honey drink in the good cups. There might be wine too, in a wealthy hall, the rare costly wine carried by trade all the way from the vineyard lands of the south to this far northern island, a luxury beyond price, brought out only for the greatest occasions. Ale for the household, mead for the honoured, wine for the very greatest of feasts, the drink flowing warm and strong through the firelit hall, the cups and horns going round. Look for a moment at the vessels the drink is served in, for they are part of the pleasure of it. There are cups of wood, turned and smoothed, and bowls passed from hand to hand, and there are the drinking horns, the true vessels of the northern feast, the horns of cattle, hollowed and polished, and sometimes bound at the rim with worked metal, a band of bronze or silver on the finer ones. A horn cannot be set down, for it has no foot to stand on, and so it must be drained or passed on, and that is part of its nature, the horn that keeps the drink moving round the benches, hand to hand, binding the company in the shared passing of it. The lady of the hall or her daughters may carry the drink along the benches and fill the horns, the bearing of the cup to the guests being a courtesy of honour, and the finest horn brimming brought first to the most honoured among them. So the drink goes round in horn and cup and bowl through the firelit hall, the vessels themselves a quiet show of the household's wealth and care. But the drinking at a Norse feast was not only for pleasure and warmth, it was also solemn and ritual, and bound up with the gods and the dead, and it is to the great toasts of the Yule feast, that we turn now, for it is the deep heart of the night. The drinking of the toasts was the most solemn and the most meaningful part of the whole feast, and to understand it is to understand something deep about these people and their relation to their gods and their dead. The cup or the horn was filled and raised and drunk in honour and in memory, with set and serious purpose. And the toasts of the feast were a kind of ritual, a turning of the drinking into worship and remembrance. There were toasts to the gods, first of all, the later writers tell us, raised at the feast for the good of the coming year. A cup to Odin, the high god, the lord of poetry and battle and wisdom, raised perhaps for victory and might. A cup to Njord and to Frey, the gods of the sea and the fruitful earth, raised for a good and peaceful year, for plenty and fair seasons, and increase for what the old words called good harvest and peace. The two things a farming people most needed and most prayed for. The household drank to the gods, raising the cup to the powers that ruled the year and the weather and the increase of the herds and the fields, asking, in the drinking, for their favour through the year to come. It was a solemn thing, the drinking to the gods, the whole hall raising the cup together at the turn of the year, and it bound the feast to the unseen powers the people lived among. And then there were the toasts to the dead, and these are the ones that catch most at the heart. For at the great feast the people remembered their dead, the kinsmen and the forebears gone before them, and they raised the cup in memory of them, the memory cup, the toast drunk to a departed father or a lost brother or the line of the ancestors. To drink to the dead was to hold them, for a moment, present again at the feast, to honour them, to keep them in the living remembrance of the household, to say that they were not forgotten, that the line ran on, that the dead were still part of the family gathered in the hall. There is a deep tenderness in that custom, and a deep human truth. The raising of the cup to the beloved dead at the great turning of the year, the gathered family remembering its lost ones in the firelight, drinking their remembrance, keeping them. It is one of the oldest and most touching of all the things people do, this remembering of the dead at the midwinter feast, and it reaches across all the centuries to anyone who has ever, at the turning of a year, or thought with love and grief of someone gone. The household drinks the memory of its dead tonight, in the hall, against the night, and the dead are present in the drinking, held and honoured and unforgotten. Let that settle over you, the memory cup raised in the firelight, before we turn to the gods themselves, the powers the household drank to, and the world they believed they lived in. The household drank to the gods tonight, and to feel the weight of that, you should know something of those gods, and of the world the Norse believed they lived in, for it was a strange and a grand and a sombre vision, unlike anything in our own age, and it lay beneath everything these people did. I should tell you a little of the old gods and the old world, as the people in this hall understood them. The Norse worshipped many gods, a great company of powers, but a few stood above the rest in the minds of the people. There was Odin, the High One, the chief of the gods, the lord of wisdom and poetry and battle, and the dead, a strange and a deep and a not wholly comforting god, who had given an eye for wisdom, and who gathered the slain warriors to his hall, the patron of kings and poets and the seekers after hidden knowledge. There was Thor, the thunder god, the red-bearded defender of gods and men, who rode the storm and swung the hammer against the giants and the monsters, and he, more than the lofty Odin, was the god of the ordinary farming people, the friend and protector of the household, the god a farmer might turn to most readily, strong and honest and near. There was Frey and his sister Freya, the gods of fruitfulness and increase and love and plenty, who gave the good seasons and the fertile fields and the increase of the herds, the gods most bound up with the prosperity of a farming life. And beyond these were many more, a thronging company of gods and goddesses and lesser powers. And beyond them again the giants, the ancient enemies of the gods, and the dwarfs and the elves and all the unseen beings, the Norse believed thronged the unseen. And the deep order of things, in their vision, was a grand and a tragic structure. At its centre stood the wide world tree, the vast ash that held all the worlds in its branches and its roots, and around and among its levels lay the worlds of gods and men and giants and the dead. And over it all hung a doom, for the Norse believed uniquely and starkly among the peoples of the earth that their gods were not eternal, that the great order itself was fated to end, that a day would come, the doom of the gods, when the powers of chaos would break loose, and the gods themselves would go down fighting in a last great battle, the sun be swallowed, the earth burn and sink into the sea. The gods themselves were doomed, and knew it, and fought on regardless. And there is something in that vision, the bright doomed order facing its certain end with courage, that shaped the very spirit of the Norse, their hard, clear-eyed acceptance of fate, their valuing of courage above hope. The household raising the cup to such gods tonight worshipped powers who were themselves under sentence, and drew from that somehow not despair, but a stern and steady courage. Let us turn to that, to the Norse sense of fate, for it is the deepest of all in their world. At the root of the whole Norse vision lay fate, the conviction that the course of every life was woven and fixed, that what would come, and that no man could escape his appointed end. They pictured this in the figures of the Norns, the three great weaving women who sat beneath the world tree at the well of fate and wove the threads of every life, measuring out the destiny of gods and men alike, and what the Norns wove, none could unweave. Fate was fixed, and the day of every man's death was already set, and there was no fleeing it, and no changing it. And from this hard belief the Norse drew, not a fatalist despair, but a strange and bracing courage. And this is perhaps the noblest part of their whole creed. For if fate was fixed, and the day of death already set, then a man could not bring his death 1 hour sooner by boldness, nor put it off 1 hour by cowardice, and the one power left to him, the one part of it that was truly his, was how he met what came, with what courage and what bearing he faced the fate he could not change. And so they prized courage above all else, the steady facing of a doom one could not escape, the meeting of death and disaster with a level eye and an unbowed spirit. What mattered was not how long you lived, for that was fixed and out of your hands, but how you bore yourself, and what name you left behind. For the one thing that outlived a man was the memory of how he had lived and died, his reputation, his good name, the story told of him after. To live with courage and to die well, and to leave a name worth remembering, that was the Norse ideal, drawn from the hard belief in fixed and inescapable fate. And it gave their age a stern grandeur that still has the power to move us. The people in this hall lived by that creed, under the weaving of the Norns, facing a fixed fate with what courage they had, caring above all for the name they would leave. Now, let us turn to the keeping of those names, and to the entertainment of the feast, the telling of the old tales. For it was in the tales that the names lived on. As the feast goes on, and the ale and the mead flow, and the household settles deep into the evening, the talk turns, as it always turned in the northern hall, to the telling of tales. For the spoken word was the art and the great entertainment and the memory of these people, and a feast was above all an occasion for the telling. There was no reading and writing to speak of. in the way we know it, no books, and so all that the people knew of their gods and their heroes and their ancestors lived in the spoken word, in the tales and the poems carried in memory and told aloud in the hall, and the telling of them was the height of the evening's pleasure. There might be a skald in the hall, a poet, for the Norse prized poetry above almost every art, and a skilled poet was honoured and rewarded, welcome at any hall and at the courts of kings. The skald would recite his verses, the dense and intricate and elusive poetry of the North, in praise of the master, or of some great deed, or some god or hero, the carefully wrought lines that were the highest achievement of their art. And whether or not there was a skald, there would be the telling of the old tales, the stories of the gods and their doings, of Thor and his battles with the giants, of Odin and his wisdom, of the great heroes of old and their deeds and their deaths, and above all, perhaps, the tales of the family's own ancestors, the settlers who had come to the island, the feuds and the voyages and the deeds of the forefathers, the stories that were the household's own history and its pride. These were the tales that generations later would be written down at last and become the great sagas of Iceland, the noblest literature of the medieval North. But on this night, they lived still in the spoken word, told aloud in the firelit hall, carried in the memory of the old and passed to the young. To sit in the hall in the depth of the winter night, the feast eaten, the ale going round, and to listen to the old tales told in the firelight. The deeds of gods and heroes and ancestors unrolling in the dim, warm room while the snow falls outside, was the deepest pleasure the northern winter held, and it is a pleasure we can still feel the shape of. The gathering for stories by the fire against the dark. There were games too, to fill the evenings, board games of skill played with carved pieces on marked boards, games of strategy that the Norse loved, and riddles, and contests of wit, and knowledge, and verse. But the heart of it was always the telling, the old tales in the firelight, the words that carried the whole memory and wisdom and pride of the people. Let me say a little more of that, of the power of the word in this age, for it goes deeper than entertainment. The spoken word was everything in this life, and a man's word and a man's name were among the most serious things he possessed. There was no writing to fix agreements, and so a man's spoken word, his oath, his promise, was the very bond of all dealing, and to break one's given word was among the deepest of shames. Oaths were sworn with great solemnity, often at the midwinter feasts, and at Yule especially men might swear binding oaths of what they would do in the year to come. Great vows made over the cup in the hearing of the hall, binding themselves before the household and the gods to some deed or course. The given word was sacred, and the man who kept his word was honoured, and the man who broke it was despised. And beyond the single word was the matter of the name, the reputation, the story that would be told of a man after he was gone. We have seen how the Norse, believing in fixed fate, cared above all for the name they would leave, and the hall was the place where names were made and kept and lost. For it was in the hall, in the telling, that a man's deeds became a story, and the story was what outlived him, the one thing that fate could not take, the memory of how he had lived and what he had done, carried on in the tales told by the fire after he was dust. To leave a good name, a story worth the telling, was the nearest thing to immortality the Norse believed in, and the hall, with its tales and its memory, was the keeper of that immortality. The dead toasted in the memory cup, the ancestors whose deeds were told in the firelight, lived on in just this way, in the word, in the memory, in the story kept alive in the hall. There is something to hold in that, the word as the keeper of the dead, the story as the only life beyond death, the snug hall as the place where the names of the gone were kept against forgetting. Let us carry it with us as we turn now to the night beyond the firelight, and to what the people of the hall believed waited in the winter night outside. Out past the firelight, beyond the bright hall, lay the winter night, and to the people of the Longhouse that night was not the empty thing it is to us, but a living dark, full of meaning and of presence. And the Yule season above all was a time when the boundary between the safe-lit circle of the living and the wild outer world of the unseen was felt to grow thin. Let me tell you of that, of the night beyond the walls and what the people believed waited in it, though we must hold it gently, for it is the hardest part of their world to recover and the easiest to make too much of. The winter night in Iceland was a thing of a depth and a length we can scarcely imagine. At that latitude, near the top of the world, the midwinter sun barely rose at all, lifting for a few grey hours above the southern hills and sinking again, so that the days were a brief twilight and the nights swallowed almost the whole turning of the day. And there was no other light in all that frozen land, no lamp or fire for miles but the small kept flames of the scattered halls, so that beyond the door of the Longhouse lay a darkness and a silence and a cold so complete, so total, so unbroken, that it pressed on the spirit like a living weight. The people lived through months of that, the long swallowing nights, the brief grey days, the snow and the storm, the small lit hall, an island in an ocean of frozen dark, and into that great outer night the people projected, as people have always done, the shapes of their fears and their beliefs. They believed the land was full of unseen beings, the spirits of the land, the hidden folk of the rocks and the hills, who must be respected and not offended. They believed, some of them, in the restless dead, the dead who did not lie quiet in their grave mounds, but walked again. The again walkers, heavy and cold and malevolent, who might trouble the living. And the winter nights were the time such things were most feared. And Yule itself, the year's turning, the still point of the dark, was held to be a time when the unseen drew near, when the dead and the spirits and the powers were abroad, when the boundary between the worlds grew thin. The feasting and the firelight and the gathering were in part a drawing together against all that, a making of a bright, safe, warm centre of the living against the thronging dark and its unseen presences. We should not paint it too luridly, for these were not people paralysed by terror, but going steadily about their hard lives, and much of this we know only dimly and late. But the sense of it was real, the feeling that the winter night was not empty, but watchful, that the hall was a refuge not only from the cold, but from the unseen. That at Yule the other world drew close, and it makes the heat and the light and the company of the feast all the more precious. The bright hall held off not only the cold and the dark, but against the very presences the dark was felt to hold. Let us draw back, then, from that outer night, and return to the fireside, and look at the other living things that shared the Longhouse with the people, the animals. For the people were not alone in the Longhouse through the winter, or not quite, for in many a Norse farm the beasts were brought in under the same long roof, or into a byre built against the hall, to share the shelter and the heat through the hardest season, and their warm breathing presence was part of the life of the winter house. The cattle above all, the precious cows on which so much of the household's food depended, were housed close through the winter, fed on the hay so laboriously gathered in the summer, sheltered from the killing cold. And there might be sheep and goats and the horses besides, the whole patient stock of the farm, gathered in under shelter from the season. There is something deeply homely and ancient in that. The beasts and the people sheltering together under the one roof through the winter, the warm animal smell and the low sounds of the stock mingling with the life of the household, the shared warmth of living things drawn together against the cold. The animals gave their warmth to the house, quite literally, the heat of their great bodies helping to hold off the chill, and they gave the comfort of their presence, the homely sounds of them in the dark, the sense of the whole living household, beasts and people both, brought in safe together for the winter. They were the wealth of the farm, these beasts, the very foundation of survival, tended and valued, and kept alive through the winter, with as much care as the household tended itself. And on the feast night, they too are there. The warm, patient presence of the stock under the roof, part of the life of the winter farm. Let us hold that homely warmth, the beasts and the people together, under the turf, as we look now at the whole texture of living in such a house through the season. To live in the Longhouse through the winter was to live a life utterly unlike our own, close and communal and indoor and dim, and it is worth dwelling on the texture of it, for it shaped everything. The winter was long, and the work of the warm season was done, and so the household drew indoors into the one hall, and lived there, all of them together, through the winter months, in a closeness that we, with our separate rooms and our private lives, can scarcely imagine. There was little of privacy in it, and little of solitude. The household lived in the one room. The hall ate there, and worked there, and told their tales there, and slept there, ranged along the benches, all their lives lived out in the company of all the rest, day after day, through the whole long season. The work of the winter was indoor work, the work that could be done in the dim hall by the fire, and above all, it was the work of cloth, the endless spinning and weaving and sewing that clothed the household. The women at the looms and the spindles, the men at their own crafts, the mending of tools and gear, the carving of wood and bone, the making and repairing of all what the farm needed. The dim days were filled with this quiet indoor labour, the household at its work by the firelight and the lamplight, and the evenings with the talk and the tales. It was a slow, close, patient life, the winter life of the Longhouse, lived in the dim company of the whole household, waiting out the dark season until the glow and the work of summer should come again. And there was a deep warmth in that closeness, for all that we might find it hard, the heat of the entire household gathered together through the winter, sharing the one fire and the one roof and the one long waiting for the spring, knowing each other utterly bound together in the deep enforced intimacy of the winter hall. It was the oldest way of living there, is the assembled household in the one warm room against the winter, and these people knew its hardships and its closeness and its deep human warmth, as we in our separate and private and well-lit lives perhaps never will. Let us look now at what made that warmth and that light possible. The fire and the lamps and the turf walls that held the winter out. We have spoken of the hearth fire, the great central blaze that was the heart and the comfort and the chief light of the hall. But there was other light too, in the dim Longhouse. The small lights that supplemented the fire in the dead of the winter darkness. There were lamps, simple lamps of stone, hollowed vessels of soapstone filled with oil, the oil of fish or of seabird or of seal, with a wick of twisted plant fibre floating in it, giving a small, steady flame, and these little stone lamps, set here and there about the hall, added their soft points of light to the glow of the fire. The light they gave was small and dim and golden, and the hall at night was never brightly lit as our rooms are, but a place of warm, dim glow. The firelight and the lamplight pooling in the centre and along the benches and fading into deep shadow at the edges and the high roof. The people lived in that dimness through the winter, their eyes long since used to it. The warm, low golden light of fire and oil lamp, the whole illumination of their dark season. And the warmth was held by the very building, by the thick walls of turf and stone that were the genius of the northern house. In a land with little timber, the people built with what they had, with turf, the cut sods of the grassy earth, and with stone raising thick, heavy walls of turf and stone, sometimes many feet thick, and roofing the hall with turf as well, laid over a frame of precious timber. And those thick turf walls were a wonderful insulation, holding the glow of the fire within and the cold of the winter, without far better than any wall of timber or stone alone, so that the Longhouse, humble as it looked, half buried in its own turf and the drifted snow, was a snug and a warm refuge against the bitterest cold, the heat of the fire held close by the thick turf walls. To this, the people added all the warmth they could make, the woolen clothes and cloaks, the bedding and the furs and the skins heaped on the benches where they slept, the whole apparatus of warmth against the cold, and so the Longhouse, for all the savagery of the winter outside, was within a place of warmth and dim golden light and gathered life, the turf walls holding the heat, the fire blazing, the lamps glowing, the household warm in its woolens and its furs, an island of heat and light in the frozen dark. Let us move now from the warm inner life of the hall to the wider world beyond the island, the open seafaring realm these people belonged to, for the Longhouse, remote as it was no prison, and its people were part of a vast and a far-ranging world. Remote as the island was, far out in the cold northern ocean, its people were not cut off from it, but were part of one of the most far-ranging and adventurous civilizations the age had then seen. And to understand the people in the hall, you must understand the great seafaring realm they belonged to, for the sea was their road and their element. And it reached from this frozen island to the edges of the known earth and beyond. The Norse were, above all, a seafaring people, and it was the ship that had made them what they were. Their long ships, the marvels of the age, slender and strong and beautiful, clinker-built of overlapping planks, light enough to be drawn up on a beach, and seaworthy enough to cross the open ocean, had carried them out across all the northern seas in the centuries before this night. In those ships they had gone raiding, the Viking raids that gave the age its name and its terror, falling on the coasts and the rivers of distant lands. In those ships they had gone trading, for the Norse were great merchants as well as raiders, carrying goods along the rivers of the east as far as the markets of the great cities and across the western seas, dealing in furs and walrus ivory and the homespun cloth and the slaves and all the goods of the north. And in those ships they had gone settling and exploring, pushing out across the empty ocean to find and people new lands. And Iceland itself was one such land, found and settled by these ocean voyagers only a few generations before. And the voyaging had not stopped at Iceland. From this island, in just about these years, the Norse pushed on further still, west and west into the unknown ocean, to the ice-bound island they called Greenland, where they made new settlements at the very edge of the habitable lands. And from Greenland, the tales tell, on west again, to a wooded land beyond the western sea, a land they called Vinland, which was the coast of a whole new continent, the land we now call North America, reached by these northern voyagers in their open ships 500 years before any other European came there. The people in this hall, sitting at their Yule feast on their remote island, belonged to that age, the realm of the ocean voyagers, and the talk in the hall might well turn to such things, to voyages made and voyages planned. To kinsmen gone west to Greenland, to the far lands beyond the sea, to the wide seas that their ships could reach. The Longhouse was remote, but it was a node in a vast web of sea roads that spanned half the world, and its people knew themselves part of that bold venturing. There is a wonder in that worth holding, the thought of these people at the cold far edge of the earth, in their turf hall under the snow, who were yet among the boldest travellers the earth had known, whose ships had touched 3 continents, who sat at their winter feast with the knowledge of the great ocean roads in their blood and their memory. The hall was small and the island was remote, but the life these people belonged to was vast. And the sea that surrounded their frozen island was not a wall, but a road. The road their fathers had come by, and their kinsmen still travelled out to the edges of the world. Let us pass now from the wide sea world to a smaller and more human matter, the look of the people themselves, how they dressed and adorned themselves. For the appearance of a people brings them close. Look at the people gathered along the benches in the firelight, at how they are dressed, for the Norse, though they lived hard, were not without their love of fine things and bright colour and good adornment, and on a feast night they would have worn their best. The cloth of their clothing was wool, above all, the woolen homespun that the women wove through the winter, and linen too for those who could get it, for linen was finer and more costly. The men wore tunics, falling to the knee, over trousers with cloaks for warmth, fastened at the shoulder, and the women wore long gowns, and over the gown a kind of apron dress. A panel of cloth hung from the shoulders by 2 straps, and the straps were fastened at the breast by a pair of brooches, the great oval brooches of bronze that were the signature ornament of the Norse woman, and between the brooches there might hang a string of beads, of glass and amber and other precious stones, a bright display across the breast, for the Norse loved colour and ornament and the show of wealth upon the body. The cloth was dyed in what colours they could make or buy, and the wealthy wore bright and costly hues, the reds and blues and greens that dye could give. They loved jewellery, and wore it, the brooches and the arm rings and the neck rings and the beads, of bronze and silver and gold, the wealth of a family worn upon its persons. For arm rings of silver were a store of wealth, as well as an ornament, given by lords to their followers, broken to pay for goods. They wore furs against the cold, and good leather shoes, and the men bore their weapons, or at least their knives, for a free man went armed. And they tended their appearance, for the sagas tell us, the Norse were particular about cleanliness and grooming, combing their hair and their beards, washing, caring for their looks more than many peoples of that age. So the household gathered at the feast tonight is no drab company, but a bright one. The people in their best woolens dyed in good colours, the women with their oval brooches and their strings of beads, the wealth of silver on the arms of the great, the firelight catching the metal and the colour, a warm, bright gathering of a people who, hard as their lives were, loved colour and adornment and the showing of what they had. Now let us look at the youngest among them, the children of the Longhouse, for they too are at the feast. There are children in the hall, of course, as there are children everywhere, and the Longhouse was their whole world, and their childhood, like everything in that life, was shaped early toward the life they were born to. They grew up in the close communal life of the hall, among the household, with little of the sheltered separate childhood we know, learning by watching and doing. Drawn into the work of the farm as soon as they were able, the small tasks given to small hands, the herding and the fetching and the helping, the long apprenticeship of a life of labour begun almost as soon as they could walk. They were raised toward the roles that waited for them, the boys toward the work of the men, the farming and the fishing and the seafaring and the bearing of arms, the girls toward the work of the women, the dairy and the cloth and the keeping of a household. They learned the skills of survival in that hard land, and they learned too the lore of their people, the tales and the poems and the names of gods and of the deeds of the ancestors, soaking up in the dim winter evenings by the fire, the whole memory and wisdom and pride of their kin, so that they might carry it on in their turn. And they were loved in the way of their age, and they played, for children play in every world with what they had, with carved toys and bones and the games children make for themselves, in the corners of the hall and out in the snow. They grew up quickly in that world and took on the burdens of the adult life early. But they were children still, and on the feast night they are there, the young of the household, wide-eyed at the firelight and the tales and the abundance, the next turning of the long line of the people, the ones who will carry the hall and the name and the memory on into the years to come. Tonight they feast with the rest, and listen to the old tales, and grow sleepy at last in the warmth, and are gathered to their places on the benches, the children of the Longhouse, the future of the household, warm and fed and safe at the feast of the year. I want to show you next the matter that bound all these people together and held their society in order even without a king, the matter of the law. The people of this hall lived under no king, and that is one of the most remarkable things about them, for the Iceland of this age was a country without a crown, without a central ruler, without any king or lord set over the whole. And yet it was not a place of mere chaos and the strong hand, for it was held together by something the Icelanders prized above almost all things, the law. I want to tell you of that, for it is one of the glories of this people, and it shaped the world the household lived in. When the settlers had come to the empty island, they had come in large part to escape the growing power of the kings of Norway, to be free men on their own land, beholden to no lord, and so they made no king in their new country. Instead, they made law, and an assembly to declare it and to judge by it. Each district had its local assembly, its thing, where disputes were aired and judged, and once a year, in the summer, the free men of the whole island, or their chieftains and their followings, gathered at a great plain for the Althing, the assembly of the country, the oldest such national gathering in the world that has come down to us. There, at the Althing, the law was recited aloud from memory by the law speaker, the man whose office was to hold the whole law in his head and declare it, for there was no written law book then. Only the law carried in memory and spoken aloud to the gathered people. There, the great cases were judged, the feuds and the killings and the disputes that the local things could not settle, and there the affairs of the whole country were ordered, by free men, under the law, without a king. It was an imperfect order and a hard one, for it had no king and no central power to enforce its judgments, and so a man who won his case at law might still have to enforce it himself, with his kin and his following. And the line between law and feud could be thin, and the sagas are full of the killings, and the feuds and the long bloody quarrels that ran through this society. But it was law, and it was order of a kind, and the Icelanders prized it fiercely. The idea that they were a people governed by their own law, declared by themselves, without a king over them, free men holding their own land under their own justice. The master of this hall, if he was a chieftain, a Goi, would ride to the Althing each summer with his following, and take his part in the law and the assembly of the free. And the law was a part of the very air these people breathed, the frame of their proud, independent life. Let us turn from the matter of the law to the small matter of the everyday, and look at the ordinary shape of a winter day in the Longhouse. For the feast is one night, but the life was made of the long, ordinary days around it. An ordinary day in the Longhouse, in the deep of winter, was a slow and a dim and an indoor thing, shaped by the vast darkness and the cold, and it ran to a rhythm quite unlike the days of summer. The household woke in the dark, for the sun would not rise for hours yet, if it rose at all to speak of, and the first work was the tending of the fire, the building up of the blaze that had been banked through the night, and the tending of the beasts, the feeding of the precious stock that sheltered under the roof or in the byre, on the hay so carefully gathered against just this season. Then the slow work of the dim day, the indoor work of the lean months. The women to their cloth, the spinning and the weaving, and the sewing that filled the winter, the great looms standing against the wall, the endless making and mending of the woolens the household lived in. The men to their own crafts and labours, the mending of tools and gear and harness, the working of wood and bone and leather and iron, the making of all the things the farm needed, the care of the beasts. There was food to prepare, the stored food brought out and made ready, the cauldrons tended over the fire. There was the fetching of water and fuel, the hard outdoor tasks done quickly in the cold and the brief grey light. It was a life of quiet, patient, indoor labour, through the short, dim days, all of it done in the warm gloom of the hall by the light of the fire and the little lamps. The household at its work. And then the early dark, which was hardly a change, for the day had been dark enough, And the evening, which was the best of the day, the work set by, the household drawn close at the fire, the food eaten, and then the talk and the tales and the games, the warm sociable evening that was the reward of the dim laborious day. And then sleep, the household bedding down along the benches in the warmth, to wake again in the night and begin again. That was the shape of the winter days, slow and dim and close and laborious, turning over one into the next through the winter season. And the feast nights like this one were the great bright punctuations of that long grey round, the gathered celebrations that lit up the dark months and gave the household something to move toward and to remember. Consider now something the feast brings sharply into focus, the great Norse virtue of hospitality, for the welcoming of the guest was sacred to these people. Hospitality was among the deepest of the Norse virtues, and the welcoming of the guest, the stranger who came to the door, was a sacred duty and a point of honour, woven deep into the values of these people. In a hard land of long distances and harsh weather, where a traveller caught out might die of the cold, the giving of shelter and food and warmth to the one who came to your door was a matter of life and death, and it had become, beyond mere practicality, a matter of honour and even of holiness. The old poems are full of the praise of hospitality and the rules of it, the duty of the host to welcome and feed and warm the guest, and the duty of the guest to be courteous and grateful in his turn. And the shame that fell on the one who turned a traveller away, or who failed in the courtesies of host or guest. To open your hall to the stranger, to give him a place at the fire and food at the board, and a seat on the bench and shelter for the night, was the mark of a good and an honourable household, and the large farms prided themselves on it, on the abundance of their welcome, the glow of their hospitality. And the feast, above all, was the great showing of this virtue, the throwing open of the hall and the pouring out of the stores, the gathering in not only of the household, but of the kin and the neighbours and the guests, the warm, wide welcome of the great festival. There is a beauty in that, the sacredness of hospitality, the honour bound up in the welcoming of the stranger, the warm hall opened to whoever came to the door out of the cold and the dark. And it means that you, the traveller who came over the snow tonight and bowed in at the low door, are not an intruder, but an honoured guest, welcomed by the deepest law of the people, given your place at the fire and your share of the feast, folded into the heat of the hall by the sacred duty of the Norse welcome. Hold that, the warmth of the welcome, as we return now to the feast, which is deepening toward its solemn heart, the swearing of the oaths. As the feast goes deep into the night, and the ale and the mead have gone round many times, and the household is snug and full and loosened, the evening may turn to the swearing of oaths, for the feasts and Yule, above all, were the time when men made their solemn vows, and there was no more binding place to swear than the feast in the hearing of the gathered hall and the gods. A man might rise over the cup and swear before all the household what he would do in the year to come, some deed of vengeance or of venture, some great undertaking, some course he bound himself to. The vow made solemn by the feast and the drink and the witnessing of all, a thing he could not now go back on without deep shame. The oath sworn at the Yule feast was among the most binding a man could make, and the making of such vows was part of the deep seriousness that ran beneath the comfort and the cheer of the festival, the turning of the year being the time to look forward and to bind oneself to what the new year would hold. There is a weight in that, the solemn oaths of the feast, the men binding themselves before the hall and the gods to the deeds of the coming year. And it shows you again the depth of seriousness in these people, the way their feasting was bound up with honour, and the word and the shape of the life to come. The bright feast was not only pleasure, but a solemn turning point of the year, a time of remembering the dead and honouring the gods and binding oneself to the future, all drawn into the one great, gathered in the face of the dark. Let us hold the weight of it, the oaths and the toasts and the remembering, as the feast now begins, slowly, to wind toward its close, and the evening turns at last toward rest. But before it does, let me set you down properly within it, for a while, not as one looking on, but as one of the company, so that you can feel the warm heart of the feast from the inside. So let yourself be there, now fully, one of the company on the bench, for we have walked all round this world as watchers and namers of things, and it is time to simply sit in it, to feel the heart of the Yule feast from within as one of the household on the night of the gathering. Settle onto the bench in the firelight and let the hall close around you. Feel first the warmth, the deep enfolding heat of the hall after the killing cold outside, the heat of the hearth fire reaching you where you sit, the press of the gathered bodies along the bench, the thick turf walls holding it all close, so that your cold hands and your cold face ease and loosen, and the chill goes out of you, and you are warm all through, in a way that means more in that frozen land than we can easily know, and feel the light, the restless golden firelight filling the long room, throwing the faces into ruddy relief, and the great shadows up the walls and along the dim roof, the little stone lamps glowing here and there, the hall a golden glow against the black winter night beyond the walls. Then the smells, the rich layered smells of the feast, the wood smoke of the fire, the savour of the roasted and boiled food, the sharp, clean smell of the ale and the sweetness of the mead, the smell of wool and leather and the homely animal smell from the byre, the smell of many people gathered close, the whole thick, rich scent of a hall full of living and feasting. And the sounds, the deep sociable murmur of the household, the talk and the low laughter running along the benches, the clatter of the vessels, the voice of the one who tells the tale rising over it, the settling and crackling of the long fire, the whole glad noise of the feast. And you have your place in it, your seat on the bench, your share of the feast. There is food set before you, more and richer than the household sees in all the winter besides. And you eat it in the warmth, your fill and more. There is a cup or a horn that is filled and filled again, the strong ale, the sweet mead, if you are honoured, passed along the bench, and you drink, and the glow of it spreads through you. When the cup is raised to the gods, you raise yours with the rest. When it is raised to the remembered dead, you drink with the household to the ones they have lost, and perhaps to your own. You listen to the tales told in the firelight, the old deeds of gods and heroes and ancestors unrolling in the dim firelit room. You are one of the company, folded into the heat and the plenty and the fellowship of the feast, the guest given a place by the sacred welcome. The cold and the dark and the long winter all shut out beyond the turf walls, and there is a profound and simple joy in it, the joy that the feast was made to give, the joy of comfort and plenty and company at the dead point of the year, of being gathered safe and fed and glad among others, while the vast winter night presses on the walls. Strip away all the strangeness, the gods and the long ships and the 1,000 years, and here is a thing you know in your own bones, the gladness of the bright gathered to meet the night and the frost. The deep human pleasure of the feast in the depth of the winter, the company and the firelight and the full cup and the old tales, the holding off of the night by warmth and togetherness and plenty. It is one of the oldest joys there is, and the household knew it as deeply as any people ever have gathered at their Yule feast in their warm turf hall at the edge of the world, and tonight you know it with them. One of the company on the bench, warm and fed and glad in the firelit hall. Let the feast hold you there a while. At its glad height, the fire blazing, the cups going round, the tales rising and falling. The whole household gathered glad in the teeth of the winter night. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, but sit in the warmth and the light and the good company, and let the long evening carry you. The hardest and the darkest point of the whole year is this, the dead of the midwinter. And against it, the household has made this, the warmest and the brightest and the gladdest gathering of the year. And you are in the middle of it, held in the very heart of the feast, the winter dark, held off beyond the walls by fire and plenty and the company of the hall. And slowly, as the dead of the night comes on, the feast begins to change its note, to soften and to quiet, as all feasts do at last. The first high tide of the eating and the drinking and the loud, glad talk begins, very gradually, to ebb. The voices grow lower and slower and warmer. The tales told by the fire turn from the loud, heroic deeds to the quieter and the older and the more wondrous ones, the kind that are told late, when the night is deep and the listeners are growing drowsy. The cups still go round, but more slowly now and more gently. The children have grown sleepy, and the youngest are already nodding where they sit, or curled and sleeping on the benches in the warmth. The whole hall, so loud and bright at the height of the feast, begins to settle toward the long ease of the night's end, the comfort and the fullness, and the strong drink and the late hour drawing the household down, by slow degrees, toward sleep. Let us follow that settling, gently, as the feast wins toward its rest, and the longhouse turns at last toward the night. As the feast quiets and the night deepens, it is worth pausing on the meaning of the very moment we are living through, the dead of the year. For Yule sat at the still heart of the wheel of the seasons, and to the people of the north, that wheel was the great shape of all their living. Their whole life turned with the year, far more closely than ours. Bound to the season and the weather and the light in a way our sheltered lives have largely forgotten. The year of the north was a wheel of two great halves, the light half and the dark half, the summer and the winter, and the people lived very differently in each. The summer was the time of work and light and the open air, the brief, intense season when the sun scarcely set, and the life of the farm poured outward into labour, the haymaking and the herding and the fishing and the sailing, the gathering in of all that must carry the household through the winter, the season when the ships went out, and the men went voyaging and trading, and to the Althing, and to war. And the winter was the dark half, the time of drawing in, when the work of the land was done, and the light failed, and the household pulled indoors into the hall, to live out the long night season on the gathered store of the summer. The season of the fire and the loom and the tale, of waiting and enduring, until the light came round again. And Yule stood at the very turning between them, at the dead bottom of the year, the longest night, the still point where the dark was deepest, and the light at its very lowest, and where, even as the people feasted, the wheel was turning, the sun beginning its slow climb back, the light beginning, by the smallest degrees, to return. That is the deep meaning of the midwinter feast, that it falls at the turning, at the moment when the dark is greatest, but is just beginning to give way, the feast of the year reborn, the light's return, the promise that even now, at the blackest point, the wheel is turning back toward the sun. The people may not have framed it in just those words, but they felt it, the turning of the year at Yule, the feast at the bottom of the dark that was also the feast of the light beginning to come back. And it gave the festival its deep resonance, the gathered in the face of the longest night that was also the welcoming of the lengthening days to come. Hold that, the turning of the wheel at the dead of the year, as we listen now to one of the tales that might be told at such a feast, a tale of the gods. For the tales told at the feast were often tales of the gods, and of all the gods it was Thor, the thunderer, the friend of the farming folk, whose tales were best loved, and one such might be told tonight by the fire, the kind of tale the household knew by heart and loved to hear again. They are tales full of a rough humour and a great vigour. The Thor tales, For Thor was not a remote and awful god, but a near and a hearty one, mighty and quick-tempered, and not always wise. Forever journeying out to the land of the giants to do battle with the monstrous enemies of gods and men, swinging his great hammer, the mightiest weapon in all the worlds, against the trolls and the giants and the serpent that lay coiled around the earth. There were tales of Thor's journeys to the giant lands, where his strength was tested by trickery, and he was made to look foolish and yet showed, even in seeming defeat, a might that shook the foundations of all things. There were tales of his fishing for the wider world serpent, hauling the monster up from the deep on his line until the very gods trembled. There were tales of the tricks played on him and the tricks he played, of his journeys with the cunning Loki, of his battles and his feasts and his prodigious strength and appetite. And running under all the rough humour was the deep matter of it, that Thor was the defender, the one who stood between the ordered realm of gods and men and the chaos of the giants and the monsters, who held the line against the powers that would tear it all apart, and who was fated, at the last, at the doom of the gods, to fall at last in battle with the great serpent, slaying it and dying of its venom, the defender going down at the end with his great enemy. To hear such a tale by the fire, the household drowsy and warm, the deeds of the thunder god unrolling in the firelight, while the real winter night pressed black on the walls, was the deep pleasure of the northern evening, and it carried, under its vigour and its humour, the whole grand tragic vision of the Norse, the bright defenders holding the line against the dark, doomed and valiant to the end. Let us go now from the spoken tale to the written word. Such as these people had it, for the Norse had a writing of their own, the runes, and it is worth knowing. The Norse did not write as we write, in books and at length, but they had a writing of their own, the runes, the angular letters of the old northern alphabet, made of straight lines that could be cut into wood or stone or bone. And the runes had a place in their world both practical and mysterious. They were used for short inscriptions, for the marking of ownership and the cutting of memorials and messages, the carving of a name into a possession, the raising of a memorial stone to a dead kinsman with the runes cut into it telling who had raised it and for whom, a kind of writing in stone against forgetting. The great memorial runestones that still stand across the northern lands are the chief monuments of this writing, the carved stones raised in memory of the dead, the runes upon them speaking still, 1,000 years on, the names and the deeds of people otherwise wholly lost. And the runes had a deeper and a stranger side, for they were held to have power, to be more than mere letters, bound up with magic and wisdom and the hidden workings of things. The god Odin himself, the tale said, had won the runes through a great ordeal, hanging wounded on the world tree for 9 nights to gain their secret. The wisdom of the runes being a thing won at great cost from the depths, and so the runes carried an air of power and mystery, used not only for plain marking, but for charms and spells and the working of the will upon the world, cut for protection or for harm, or for the gaining of what was desired. To the people of the hall, the runes were both an everyday tool, the cutting of a name or a message, and a matter of power and mystery. The letters Odin won in agony, bound up with the deep hidden workings of fate and wisdom. There were not many in the hall, perhaps, who could cut and read them well, for it was something of a special skill. But the runes were part of their age, the carved angular letters that were their writing, practical and mysterious both. There is time yet, while the household drowses at the fire and the night runs on, for a few last quiet matters, the kind that are spoken of late. And the first of them follows straight from the memory cup we raise to the dead. For it is the question of where these people believed the dead had gone. Where did the dead go, in the belief of these people, the dead they had toasted in the memory cup, the kinsmen and the forebears held in the firelight? The Norse had their answers, and they were various and strange and not always consistent. The way the beliefs of an old religion are, but they are worth the knowing, for they stood behind the whole feeling of the feast and the remembering of the dead. There was, most famously, the Hall of the Slain, the Hall of Odin, to which, the warriors believed, the bravest of the fallen were carried, those who died gloriously in battle, chosen by the warrior maidens who rode over the field of the slain and bore the worthy dead away. There, in that vast hall, the chosen fell feasted, and fought and feasted again, day upon day, waiting for the last battle at the end of the world, when they would march out beside the gods against the powers of chaos. It was a warrior's heaven, the hall of the slain, the reward of a brave death in battle, and it shows you again how deep the warrior values ran, that the highest afterlife was a hall of feasting and fighting, what the warrior most prized. Gone on forever, but not all the dead were warriors, and not all who died in that age died in battle, and there were other places for the dead. There was a shadowy realm below, the realm of the dead, who died of sickness or of age, a dim, cold place under the world, ruled by a grim goddess, where the great mass of the ordinary dead were thought to go. A quieter and a greyer afterworld than the bright hall of the slain, and there was an older and an earthier belief, perhaps deeper than all the rest, that the dead lived on, somehow, in their grave mounds, in the howls raised over them, connecting the earth near the homes and the lands they had known, still in some way present, still part of the place and the family, the ancestor in his mound watching over the farm and the kin. The dead in the how were near in this belief, not gone to a far heaven, but lying in the home earth, and the living kept up a relation with them, honoured them, feared them sometimes, felt them present in the land. It was this last belief, perhaps, that lay closest under the memory cup at the feast, the sense that the dead were not utterly gone, and far away but near, present, still part of the family, to be remembered and honoured and held in the gathering at the turning of the year. The dead in their mounds, the ancestors in the home earth, were toasted and remembered at Yule because they were felt to be still there, still kin, still part of the household that drew together in the hall. The line of the dead and the line of the living joined in the one family, the one place, the one remembering. There is something deeply human and deeply comforting in that. Under all its strangeness, the sense of the dead kept near, held in memory and honour, still part of the family and the place, not lost in some far heaven, but present in the home earth and the gathered remembering. The household lived close to their dead, kept them near, remembered them at the feast, and drew comfort against the dark from the unbroken line of the kin, the living and the dead together. And behind the dead stood the gods. The great powers the household had toasted earlier in the evening, and since we have spoken so far only of Thor, let me show you a little more of that strange high company, of Odin the Wanderer, and of the fruitful powers. For they too were present in the minds of the people at the feast. Of all the gods of the north, the strangest and the deepest was Odin, the High One, and he is worth knowing a little, for he was not at all the kind of god we might expect. Not a comfortable protector, but a far stranger and more unsettling power. Odin was the god of wisdom, and of poetry, and of battle, and of the dead, and of magic. A god who ranged across all the highest and the darkest things, restless, seeking, never satisfied, forever hunting after more knowledge and more power against the doom he knew was coming. He was the wanderer, above all, the god who went disguised about the world, cloaked and hooded, a one-eyed old traveller leaning on his staff, turning up unlooked for at hall or crossroads, testing and questioning and watching. For he had given up one of his eyes, the tales said, in exchange for a draught from the well of wisdom, and he was forever seeking more, hungry for the knowledge that might help the gods endure. He had hung upon the world tree, wounded, 9 nights, to win the secret of the runes from the depths, a god who suffered for wisdom, who paid in pain and sacrifice for the hidden knowledge he craved. He was the patron of poets, the giver of the gift of verse, and the patron of kings and warriors, who gathered the brave slain to his hall, and he was a god of magic and of the dark arts of seeing and working, a master of the hidden things. There was something not wholly trustworthy in him, something deep and cold and strange, the high god who was also the god of the gallows and the raven and the restless, seeking after forbidden knowledge, and the people regarded him with awe more than with love. Against the strangeness of Odin stood the warmer and the nearer powers, the gods of fruitfulness and increase and peace, and chief among them Frey and his sister Freya, the bright gods of the fertile earth and the good season and love and plenty. Frey was the god the farmers loved for the increase of their fields and their herds, the giver of the good harvest and the kindly weather and the fruitfulness of all living things, and Freya was the goddess of love and beauty and desire, and also, in her deeper aspect, a goddess bound up with the dead and with magic and with the old craft of seeing. These were the powers a farming people most needed and most loved, the givers of the good year, of the increase on which all life depended. And the toasts raised at the feast for a fruitful and a peaceful year were raised above all to them, the bright gods of plenty. And around and beyond these great ones thronged a whole company of other powers, gods and goddesses, each with their realm and their nature, and below the gods the other beings of the world, the elves and the dwarfs and the spirits of the land, and the giants who were the ancient enemies, the whole crowded unseen world the people believed they lived among. It was a grand and a various and a sombre company, the powers of the north, ranging from the strange, high-wisdom hungry Odin, to the bright fruitful Frey, to the homely protecting Thor, and the people lived among them all, honoured them, feared them, toasted them at the feast, and felt them present, especially on the great night of Yule, when the powers were held to draw near, and the cups were raised to them in the firelit hall. We turn now from the gods to the span of a human life lived under them, from the cradle to the grave. For the shape of a life in this world was its own hard and tender thing. The span of a human life in this age was its own hard and tender thing, shorter than ours and more exposed, lived close to the bone of survival, and it is worth following from the first cry to the last rest. For it shows you the people not as figures in a feast, but as creatures of flesh, born and growing and aging and dying as we all do, under the long northern sky. Life began in danger, as it long did everywhere, the birth itself a peril to mother and child both, attended by the women of the household with what skill and what care they had. And a child once safely born was named and welcomed into the family, taken up and acknowledged and given its place in the kindred, the naming a solemn thing, for the name often carried the memory of an ancestor, the dead living on, in the named child, the line renewed. The early years were perilous, many children not surviving them, but those who came through grew quickly into the life of the farm, taking on their tasks young, learning the skills and the law of their people, hardening early to the labour and the weather of that demanding land. The grown life was a life of labour, hard and physical and unrelenting, the work of the farm and the sea and the household filling the years, the body used hard and worn by it, by the cold and the toil and the want of the lean seasons. They were a strong people, made strong by their hard life, but they were not spared its costs, the injuries and the illnesses against which they had little defence, but their own toughness and the simple remedies of the household, the herbs and the care and the endurance. Such healing as they had lay largely in the hands of the women and the wise, the knowledge of which plants might ease which ills, the binding of wounds, the tending of the sick, and beyond that there was little but the strength of the body itself and the will to endure, and many a life was cut short by what we could now easily mend. And so age, for those who reached it, was a thing earned and honoured, for to grow old in that hard world was an achievement, and the old were valued, the keepers of the old law and the wisdom, the ones who held the tales and the genealogies and the hard-won knowledge of a long life, honoured by the household for what they carried. To sit by the fire in old age, telling the young the tales of the ancestors and the wisdom of the years, was the natural close of a life well lived, the old one passing on the memory to the young before passing at last into memory in their turn. And death, when it came, was met, in the ideal of these people, with the same steady courage they prized in all things, the level facing of the fate that could not be escaped, and the dead were laid to rest, in their mounds or their graves with what was fitting, and then remembered, toasted at the feasts, kept in the memory of the kin, joining the line of the dead who stood behind the living. From the named child to the honoured elder to the remembered dead, the life ran its course, short and hard and exposed, but lived with courage and bound into the kindred, and held, at the last, in memory. Such were the lives of the people gathered in the hall, and such was the land they lived them upon, the strange island of fire and ice, to which we turn now. For it shaped them as much as anything. The island these people had come to was like no other land in the world, a country of fire and ice both, of a strangeness and a violence and a stark beauty that must have struck the first settlers with wonder and with awe, and that shaped the whole feeling of living there. Let me tell you a little of it, the land beyond the turf walls, for it is part of the life of the hall. Iceland sits far north near the edge of the frozen seas, and much of it is a high cold wilderness of rock and ice, with great glaciers, vast sheets and domes of ancient ice, lying over its uplands, rivers of ice grinding down its valleys. The frozen heart of the island, white and lifeless and immense. The settlers had taken only the habitable edges, the green coastal strips, and the river valleys where grass would grow and beasts could be kept, and beyond those narrow margins of life lay the great empty interior. The highland desert of rock and ice and ash, uninhabitable, crossed only with difficulty, a wilderness at the heart of their own island. But the island was not only ice, for it was also fire, one of the most volcanic lands on the whole earth. And the settlers had come to a country where the ground itself was alive and dangerous. There were the volcanoes, the fire mountains, that from time to time woke and poured out their fire and their ash, burying the land, blackening the sky, killing the grass and the beasts, and bringing famine. A terror that came without warning out of the very earth. There were the hot springs, the places where boiling water and steam came up out of the ground, where the earth was warm and the water steamed in the cold air. A marvel and a strangeness. The hot breath of the underworld rising through the frozen land. There were the fields of old lava, the black twisted rock where the fire had flowed and hardened, vast strange black wastes across the land. The very ground was a living thing, in Iceland, capable of fire and steam and sudden violence. The fire below the ice, the two great forces of the island locked together. It was a hard and a dangerous and an awe-inspiring land to live in. The island of fire and ice, beautiful with a stark and terrible beauty. The white glaciers and the black lava and the green margins and the steaming springs and the smoking mountains. A land that could feed you and a land that could kill you, often without warning. And the people lived on its narrow green edges, between the ice above and the fire below, holding their farms and their halls in the habitable margins, enduring its hardness, awed by its strangeness, at the mercy of its fire and its ice and its bitter weather. It is no wonder, perhaps, that a people living in such a land believed in a world that would end in fire and ice, in a doom of the gods where the world would burn and sink into the sea. For they lived in a country where fire and ice and the violence of the earth were the daily facts of life, where the ground itself might at any time open and pour out its fire. And over the fire and the ice lay the weather, which in that northern island was a power in its own right, harsh and changeable and often cruel, and a great shaper of the people's lives. The winters brought the cold and the snow and the night, and with them the storms, the gales that came howling in off the ocean, driving the snow before them, screaming over the fells, piling the drifts against the walls, shutting the household indoors for days, while the wind raged and the snow flew, and the world beyond the door was a blind, white fury. There were storms that could kill, that caught the traveller or the herdsman out and buried him, that tore at the very roofs of the halls, and the people knew them and feared them and built against them. Low and strong, and turfed deep into the earth, hunkering down through the worst of them in the warm dark of the hall, while the storm spent its rage outside. And there was the long uncertainty of it, the never knowing what the weather would bring, whether the season would be kind or cruel, whether the hay would dry or rot, whether the winter would be hard or merciful. The whole life of the farm hostage to the wind and the cold and the rain and the snow of that wild northern sky. To live there was to live always under the weather, watchful of it, shaped by it, at its mercy. And the hall on the feast night was a refuge from it, as much as from anything. The storms and the cold and the wild sky all shut out beyond the deep turf walls, while the household feasted warm within. The longhouse we are sheltering in tonight stands on the narrow green edge of that wild island of fire and ice, a small human place held in the margin of a land of glaciers and volcanoes. And that too is part of the wonder of it. The gathered life of the hall held against, not only the winter, but the very wildness of the strange land it stands on. Let us come away now from the wild land to the bonds that held the people together upon it. The deep bonds of kin and family, for kinship was the very framework of this life. The deepest bond in the world of the Longhouse, deeper than almost anything, was the bond of kin, the tie of family and blood. For in a land without a king, and with only the imperfect reach of the law, it was your kin who stood by you, who supported you, who avenged you, who were your strength and your safety in a hard and an uncertain world. To understand these people, you must understand how much their kin meant to them, for it was the very framework of their lives. A person in that life was, above all, a member of a family, a kindred, a line, and that membership defined them and protected them and bound them. Your kin were the ones who would stand with you in a dispute, who would support your case at the assembly, who would, if it came to it, take up your quarrel and avenge your wrong. For in a society where the law had no police and no king to enforce it, it was the strength and the solidarity of your kindred that protected you. The knowledge that to wrong you was to bring the weight of your whole family down in answer. To be without kin, alone, unsupported, was to be terribly vulnerable in that world, and to have a strong and a loyal kindred was the greatest of safeties. The bonds of blood ran deep. The loyalty to kin was a powerful and a binding thing, and the whole fabric of the society was woven of these family ties. The kindreds supporting and opposing and balancing one another. And marriage, in such a world, was a serious matter, a binding of families as much as of two people, arranged with care for the alliance and the property and the standing it would bring, a thing of negotiation between kindreds. But it was not without its own dignity and its own protections for the woman, for the Norse law gave women real rights in marriage, rights to property, rights of divorce, a standing that was real. And the wife who became the mistress of a household, the husfreyja with her keys, held a place of genuine authority and respect. The sagas show us marriages of policy and marriages of love and marriages of bitter discord, the whole range of human matching. and strong women who ruled their households and held their own against their husbands, and drove the great quarrels of their families with a will as fierce as any man's. Marriage bound the kindreds, made the alliances, carried the property and the blood forward into the next generation, and the family that gathered in the hall tonight was the living fruit of such bindings, the joining of lines, the carrying on of the blood. For the family was the thing that ran on, through the generations, the line of the kin, reaching back to the settlers and the ancestors, and forward to the children sleeping now on the benches. The unbroken chain of the blood that was the deepest reality of these people's lives. The dead in their mounds, the living in the hall, the children who would carry it on, all were one kindred, one line, one family reaching through time, and the loyalty to that line, the pride in it, the support of it, the carrying of it forward was the great organizing bond of all the world. When the household gathered at the feast and remembered its dead and rejoiced in its children, it was celebrating the kindred, the line, the family reaching through time, the deepest bond it knew. There is a warmth in that, the strength of the kindred, the loyalty of blood, the family reaching back and forward through the generations, gathered whole in the hall on the feast night. The living and the remembered dead and the sleeping children, all one line, one blood, one kin. Now we come to the homely matter of what fed that family all through the winters, the food world of the farm. For it was the women above all who kept the household alive. What kept the household alive through the hard winters? What stood between the people and the hunger that was never far off in that hard land was above all the food they could store, and the keeping of the food world of the farm was, in large part, the work and the wisdom of the women, the husfreyja and her household, and it is worth knowing, for it was the very foundation of survival. The heart of the northern farm's food was the dairy, the milk of the cows and the sheep and the goats, and the turning of that milk into the things that would keep. Fresh milk would not last, but the wisdom of the dairy could turn it into 100 keeping things. And this was the great women's craft of the food world, as weaving was the great women's craft of the cloth. There was butter, made and salted and stored in great quantity, a rich keeping food. There were cheeses of many kinds, the milk curdled and pressed and aged into forms that would last the winter. There was the soured milk and the whey, and above all, there was skyr, the thick cultured milk of the north, made by a careful art and kept through the season, a staple of the table, sharp and nourishing and lasting. The dairy was worked through the warm season at its height, when the beasts gave their milk, the women turning the flood of summer milk into the stores of winter food. The butter and the cheese and the skyr that would feed the household through the winter months. And around the dairy stood all the other keeping arts, the preserving of everything the farm and the wild land gave, against the long hungry winter. The fish dried hard in the wind until it would keep for years. The meat of the autumn smoked and dried and salted and soured, laid by in the stores. The berries and the wild things gathered in their season and kept as they could be kept. The hay, above all, cut and dried and stored, not for the people, but for the beasts. For to keep the beasts alive through the winter was to keep their milk and their meat and their wool, and the gathering of the winter's hay was the most anxious labour of the whole year. The difference between a farm that came through the winter and a farm that lost its stock and starved. It was a life lived always with one eye on the winter, on the stores, on whether there would be enough to last until the spring. And the wisdom and the labour that filled the storehouses against the winter months was the very wisdom and labour of survival. Much of it, the women's. The husfreyja overseeing her stores and her dairy, and her preserving with the same authority she brought to her cloth, the keeper, in a real sense, of the household's life. And the Yule feast, the great loosening of all that careful thrift, the pouring out of the gathered stores in one bright abundance, was the more meaningful for it. The showing that the year's hard provisioning had succeeded, that there was plenty laid by, that the household would come through the winter, that even at the dead of the year there could be feasting. The full boards of the feast were the visible fruit of a year's anxious labour, the dairy and the drying and the storing, the women's wisdom and the household's work. And to eat of them in the hall was to taste the success of the whole year's struggle against the hunger of the dark. Let us go on now, as the night runs on, to the deeper and stranger reaches of what these people believed, to the magic and the seeing and the hidden powers with which they held the world to be filled. The world these people lived in was filled to their minds with hidden powers, with forces and beings unseen, with magic and fate, and the workings of things beyond the plain surface of the day. And this was no idle superstition to them, but a real and a serious dimension of life, woven through everything, and the winter nights were when it pressed closest. Let me tell you something of it, the magic and the seeing, for it was part of the air they breathed. There were, they believed, those among them who could see beyond the ordinary, who had the gift or the craft of seeing into what was hidden, into the future, into the will of the powers, into the fate that was woven for a person or a household or a season. The seeress, the wise woman versed in the old craft of seeing, was a figure of real standing and real awe, sometimes travelling from farm to farm, called into a household to foretell what the coming year would hold. The season, the harvest, the fortunes of the people, and the sagas describe such a one received with great honour, set in a high seat, given the finest food, and asked, when the time was right and the proper rites were done, to look into what was to come and to speak it. To know one's fate, even a little, in that hard and uncertain age, was a thing greatly desired, and the one who could see was greatly valued. And there was magic of other kinds, the working of the will upon things by hidden means, charms for protection and for healing and for harm, the power held to lie in certain words and certain rites and certain objects, in the runes cut for a purpose, in the spells known to those who knew them. It was believed that a person skilled in such arts could raise storms or calm them, could bring or break a fortune, could heal or curse, could work upon the unseen forces that ran beneath the surface. Much of this lay in the hands of women, the old craft of seeing and working being held to be especially theirs, and the wise woman, the one who knew the hidden things, was a figure of both reverence and unease, holding a power that stood a little outside the ordinary run of life. We cannot now know how much of this was truly done and believed, and how much is the colouring of the later tales, but the sense of it was real. The conviction that the air was full of hidden powers, and that some could see and work upon them, that fate could be glimpsed, that the unseen pressed close, especially in the dark of the year. It deepened the whole feeling of their age. This sense of the hidden made the winter nights more charged and the feasts more solemn. Set the seeress in her high honour and the magic worker in her awe. And it is part of why the warm, bright gathered hall meant so much, for it was the known and the lit and the safe, the human circle of warmth and company, set against not only the cold and the night, but the vast unseen realm of powers and fate and hidden things that pressed in beyond the firelight. Let me lead you now from the hidden powers to a very human power, the power of honour and reputation and the word, and to the feuds and the law that ran through this world. For the keeping of honour was the driving force of their lives. The great driving force of these people's lives, beyond even the love of kin and the fear of the cold, was honour. The keeping of one's good name and standing in the eyes of others. And to understand them, you must understand how much honour meant, and how the keeping of it shaped the whole hard order of their society. It was, in a sense, the very currency of the society, more precious than silver, the thing a person could not live without. A person's honour was their standing, their worth in the eyes of the community, the respect they were owed and could command, and it was a fragile and a precious thing, easily wounded, hard to restore. An insult, a slight, a wrong done and not answered could damage a person's honour, and damaged honour had to be repaired. For a person whose honour was lost and not redeemed, sank in the eyes of all, became a matter of contempt, lost the very standing that made life worth living in that age. And so the answering of wrongs, the redress of insults and injuries, the defence of one's honour and one's family's honour was among the most serious of all obligations, a duty that could not be shirked without shame. This is the root of the feuds that run through the old tales, the long bitter quarrels between families that could pass down the generations, wrong answered with wrong, the obligation to redress an injury to one's kin driving the cycle on. It was a hard and a dangerous aspect of this world, the readiness to answer a wrong, the weight of the duty to defend one's honour and avenge one's kin, and it could turn deadly. The quarrels running to real harm and lasting enmity between families. We need not dwell on the darkness of it, but we should not pretend it away either, for it was real, the hard edge of the honour culture. The feuds that the love of name and the duty to kin could drive, and it was against just this, the endless cycle of wrong and redress, that the law stood, the achievement of these people, the assembly and the law speaker and the judgments at the thing, which existed precisely to give away to settle quarrels without endless bloodshed, to set a price on a wrong that could be paid in goods rather than answered in harm, to bring the feuds to law and judgment rather than letting them run on forever. The law was the people's attempt to hold the peace in a society driven by honour and kin, and the duty of redress, to channel the fierce energies of the honour culture into judgment and settlement. And it was, for all its imperfections, a remarkable thing, a people governing the dangerous force of their own values by their own law, without a king to hold them down. The household in the hall lived in that tension, the fierce code of honour and the steadying frame of the law, the love of name and the rule of the assembly, and on the feast night, with the oaths sworn and the cups raised and the whole community gathered, both were present, the honour that drove them and the law that bound them. Come now to something gentler. The love these people had for words and poetry and the play of language, for amid all the hardness they were a people who prized the well-made word above almost anything. For all the hardness of their lives and the fierceness of their honour, these were a people who loved words above almost anything, who prized the well-made verse and the clever phrase and the play of language as among the highest of all achievements. And this love of words is one of the most appealing things about them, and it filled the evenings of the hall. Let me show you of it, for the word was their highest art. Poetry, above all, they prized, and the maker of poetry, the skald, was honoured as few others were, for the gift of shaping words into the dense, intricate, elusive verse of the North was held to be a high and a noble gift, even a gift of the gods, for poetry itself in their tales was a precious thing won by Odin from the depths and given to those he favoured. The poetry they made was not simple, but wrought and complex, full of elaborate turns of phrase, of riddling names for ordinary things, the sea called by 100 poetic names, gold and battle and ships and men, all dignified with rich and elusive figures. The whole verse a tissue of learned reference and intricate form, demanding rare skill to make and deep knowledge to follow. To compose such verse well, on the moment, in praise of a lord or a deed, was the mark of a master, and a skilled poet could win wealth and fame and welcome at any hall, his verses carrying a great one's name and fame down the years. And below the high art of the skald ran a whole world of words loved for their own sake, the riddles that tested wit and knowledge, the proverbs and the wise sayings that carried the hard-won wisdom of the people in memorable form. the word play and the clever retort and the well-turned insult. For these were a people quick with words and appreciative of them, who valued a sharp tongue and a ready answer and a memorable phrase. The old poems are full of wisdom sayings, the counsel of how to live, how to deal with others, how to bear oneself, the practical, hard-won wisdom of the North set into memorable verse, and these too were carried in memory and quoted and known. The word as the keeper of wisdom as well as of fame. There is something deeply attractive in that, a hard and a practical and a warlike people who yet loved the well-made word above silver, who honoured the poet and prized the verse and filled their long winter evenings with the play and the wisdom and the beauty of language. It speaks of a richness of inner life beneath the hard surface, a delight in skill and wit and beauty, a valuing of the goods of the mind and the tongue, that we might not expect, and that brings them close. The household in the hall, drowsing now by the fire after the feast, had spent the evening in just this pleasure, the tales and the verses and the riddles and the play of words, the great art of their people unrolling in the firelight, and it was, for all its strangeness, a pleasure we know, the love of a good story well told, of words well made, of the warm evening spent in the rich company of language. And alongside the words ran the other pleasures of the feast and the hard winter, the music and the games and the merriment. And they are worth a moment too, for they filled the hall with their own kind of warmth. There was music in the hall of a kind, for the people of the North loved, song and sound as they loved words, and a feast was a place for it. The raising of voices and the making of music to fill the long, warm evening. We cannot now hear exactly how it sounded, the music of that distant world, for it left no notes behind it. Only the memory in the old writings that there was singing and playing at the feasts. But there was singing, the chanting of the verses and the lays, the raising of the old songs, voices lifted together in the firelit hall. And there were instruments, simple ones, the pipes and the stringed things, and whatever could be made to give a tune, played to accompany the song and the telling, the sound of them filling the warm room under the high dark roof. There is something to imagine in that, the music of the Longhouse, the voices and the simple instruments raised in the firelight, the old songs sounding in the snug hall while the snow lay deep outside, a sound we can no longer hear but can feel the shape of, the human voice raised in song against the winter night, the oldest music there is. And the merriment ran beyond the music, into the games and the contests, and the play that filled the winter evenings. For the people knew well how to make their own entertainment through the lean months, and a feast was the height of it. They loved their board games, the games of skill and strategy, played with carved pieces upon marked boards, games of attack and defense and cunning that two could sit over for hours by the fire, matching their wits. And the playing of them was a serious pleasure, a contest of mind to fill the evening. They loved contests of all kinds, of strength and skill and wit, the testing of one against another in feats and in riddles and in the quick exchange of clever words. They loved the riddle, especially, the puzzle set and the answer sought, the play of wit that tested knowledge and cleverness both. And on the feast night above all, the hall was full of this merriment, the games and the contests and the songs and the laughter, the household at its play in the warmth, making the long dark evening bright with its own gladness. For that, in the end, is what the feast was for, the making of gladness against the dark, and the music and the games and the merriment were as much a part of it as the food and the drink and the tales. The household filling the hall with song and play and laughter, holding off the winter night with the simple human joys of company and contest and music. We have grown used in our own age to having our merriment made for us, brought to us from outside, but these people made their own in the hall, with their own voices and their own wit and their own hands. And there is a richness in that we have half forgotten. The gladness a household can make for itself, gathered warm against the dark, with nothing but its own company, and its own songs, and its own play. The hall this Yule night rang with all of it, the music and the games and the laughter, before the long settling towards sleep, and it is good to imagine it. The bright merry hall, full of the household's own glad noise against the winter. Now let us turn from the merriment to a more solid kind of wealth, the goods and the treasures these people prized and gathered and traded, the world of things that filled a great hall like this one. A great hall like this one was a place of wealth as well as warmth, for the master of a prosperous farm gathered about him the goods and the treasures that marked his standing. And the world of things these people prized and made and traded is worth a look, for it reached, like everything in their lives, far out over the seas. Let me show you something of the wealth of the hall. The deepest wealth of all was the land and the beasts, the farm itself, the herds and the flocks and the good ground that fed them. For this was a farming people, and their substance was in their stock and their soil. But beyond that solid wealth lay the movable treasures, and chief among them was silver, for silver was the store of value in the world of the Norse, kept as coins and as ingots, and above all as ornaments. The arm rings and the neck rings and the brooches that were both adornment and wealth, worn upon the body and broken off to pay when payment was needed. A man of standing silver, worn and stored, was his treasury, and the giving of silver and gold, the open-handed generosity of a lord to his followers, was among the highest of virtues, the good lord being the ring-giver, the one who shared out his wealth and so bound men to him. And the hall held the work of craft and trade, the goods made at home and the goods brought from far away. There was the work of the smith, the tools and the weapons and the fine metalwork, for the Norse smiths were great craftsmen, and a fine sword or a well-wrought brooch was a treasure. There was the work of wood and bone and antler, the carved pieces, the combs, the vessels, the furniture of the hall, the carved high-seat pillars themselves. There was the cloth, the homespun and the finer weaves, and the goods of leather and horn. And there were the goods of trade, the goods carried across the seas to this far island, for the Norse were great traders, and a wealthy hall would hold imported treasures. Fine cloth and wine and metalwork and glass and beads, and all the precious goods that the trade routes brought from the south and the east, the wealth of distant lands gathered into the hall at the edge of the world. For the trade reached everywhere, along the rivers, to the great markets of the east, across the western seas, down to the rich lands of the south, and the goods of half the earth could find their way by many hands and many ships. To a hall in Iceland, the furs and the ivory and the homespun of the north going out, the silver and the silk and the wine and the fine wares of the south and east coming back. The hall we are sitting in, humble as its turf walls are, may hold the threads of a web of trade that spans a continent. Treasures carried half over the earth to this remote northern farm. The wealth of distant places gathered by the long sea roads into the firelit hall, and it was by those sea roads, by the ships and the voyages, that all of it came and went, the silver and the goods and the news and the people, the whole far-reaching life of this seafaring life born on the open ocean. Now we come, then, to the sea itself, the road of all this wealth and wandering, and to a voyage such as might be remembered and told of at a feast like this one. The sea was the great road of these people, and the ship was the marvel that carried them. And of all the tales told at a feast, none were more loved than the tales of voyages, the journeys out over the grey ocean to the far lands. And it is worth letting one such voyage rise in the mind as the old ones rose in the tales by the fire, for the ship and the sea were in the blood of everyone in the hall. Picture the ship itself, first drawn up now for the winter, but alive in the memory. The long open vessel of the north, slender and graceful, built of overlapping planks of timber, riveted and caulked, curving up at prow and stern. Light and supple and strong, riding the water like a living thing. Picture it under sail. The great square sail of woven wool spread to the wind, bellied taut, driving the long hull through the swell, the sea hissing and parting at the prow. The spray flung back, the whole vessel leaning and surging with the wind and the water. And picture the men aboard her, working the sail and the steering oar, bailing, watching the sky and the sea, living for days and weeks in the open boat on the open ocean, exposed to every wind and wave and cold, navigating by the sun and the stars and the flight of birds and the colour of the water and a deep, hard-won knowledge of the sea, across hundreds of miles of empty ocean to a coast they could not see until they reached it. It was a hard and a perilous thing, such a voyage, the open boat on the great cold ocean, the storms that could swallow a ship without trace, the cold, the wet, the danger, the long days of labour and watchfulness and endurance. And it was a glorious thing too, the freedom of it, the reach of it, the ship driving out across the world's ocean to wherever the wind and the courage of the crew could carry her, to the trading towns and the far coasts and the new lands beyond the sea. These people, or their fathers, had crossed such an ocean to reach their island, had come in just such ships across the grey northern sea to the new land, and many in the hall would sail again out to Norway to trade, or west to Greenland, to kin, or wherever the sea roads led. The ship was their freedom and their reach and their pride, the slender, beautiful, deadly vessel that made them what they were, the masters of the northern seas. And to tell of a voyage at the feast, in the hall in the deep of winter, the ship drawn up and the sea far off, and the storms held at bay beyond the turf walls, was to taste the great adventure of their lives from the safety of the fire, the wandering told over to the gathered household while the snow lay deep outside, the far coasts and the open ocean rising in the mind, in the warm firelit room. There is a deep pleasure in that. The tale of the voyage told by the winter fire, the great, wide, dangerous world brought into the safe, bright hall in the telling. The sea and the ship and the far lands unrolling in the imagination of the drowsy household, while the body rests easy by the banked fire. And as such a tale comes to its end, the ship brought home, the voyage done, the teller falling quiet, the whole feast too, is coming at last to its end. The tales all told, the cups all drained, the warm evening run down to its dregs, the household drowsing now in the warmth and ready, every one for sleep. Let us watch it settle, then the midwinter feast drawing to its close, the Longhouse turning at last to the night. The feast is winding now toward its close, and the hall is settling by slow, gentle degrees towards sleep. And there is no gentler thing in all the evening than the watching of it, the great gathering, easing down into the night. Let us follow it, softly, the settling of the household. The eating is long done, and the boards are cleared away, and the drinking has slowed to the last quiet cups, and the loud, glad talk of the height of the feast has softened into the low murmur of a household grown drowsy and content. The tales told by the fire have come to their ends, or trailed away into the warm silence, and the one who told them has fallen quiet. The fire, which blazed so high at the feast, is letting down now, the great logs burnt to a bed of glowing embers and low flame, still warm, still bright enough to see by, but quieter now, settling like the household toward the night. The little stone lamps are guttering low, or being put out one by one, the glow of the hall sinking to the low red glow of the banked fire. And the household begins to make its beds, such as they are. For in the Longhouse there were no separate bedchambers for most, but the benches that ran the length of the hall, the broad raised platforms on which the household had sat and worked and feasted all the evening, were the beds of the night as well. The people settle along them, the whole household finding its place, drawing up the bedding that was stowed there, the woolens and the furs and the skins, making their nests of warmth along the benches in the firelit dimness. There is an order to it, that the places along the benches, the household ranged by rank and by custom, the master and his family in their place, the servants in theirs, all of them settling down together in the single room, as they did every night of the winter, the entire household sleeping together in the hall. There is a deep homeliness in it, the bedding down of the household in the hall, the assembled company making ready for sleep together in the one warm room, the rustle and murmur of it, the settling of bodies along the benches, the drawing up of the furs, the low last words exchanged in the dimness, the children already sleeping, the old ones easing down their bones. It is a thing utterly strange to us, who sleep each in our own room behind our own door, and yet there is something in it that pulls at the heart, the closeness of it. The household gathered to sleep in the one warm space against the winter night. No one alone, all of them together in the dim red light of the banked fire, the deep old way of the household at rest. The master and the lady go to their place, which may be a little set apart, a closed bed or a curtained space at the honoured end of the hall. The nearest thing the Longhouse held to a private chamber. But even they are not far from the rest, only a little withdrawn, the heads of the household sleeping among their people as a Norse master did. The beasts in the byre have long since settled, the warm, patient bulk of them quiet in the dark at the end of the hall or beyond the wall, breathing slow in their stalls. The children are deep asleep, and one by one, along the benches, the household sinks down into the furs and the heat, and gives itself over to sleep. The long feast done, the bellies full, the bodies warm. The hard, dark winter held off beyond the turf walls by the deep heat of the banked fire and the gathered warmth of all the sleeping company. And the fire is banked for the night, the last and most important task, the long bed of embers raked together and tended and covered to hold its heat and its life through the dark hours until the morning. For the fire must not die. The keeping of the fire through the night, being among the deep cares of the household, the banked embers holding the seed of the morning's blaze. The hall sinks into the dim red glow of it, the banked fire, the only light now faint, on the sleeping faces along the benches, on the roof above, on the loom against the wall, and the gear hung on the posts, and all the dim, familiar furniture of the household's world. The Longhouse that rang so warm and loud with the feast an hour ago is quiet now, dim, full of sleeping people in the red glow of the embers, the whole household gone down at last into the warmth of sleep. There is a profound peace in it, the sleeping hall, the household at rest in the dim glow, the feast done and the night deep, and the whole company safe and full and content and asleep together in the one long room while the winter rages far off outside the walls. All the seriousness and the labour and the hardness of their lives is stilled now in sleep. And what remains is only the oldest and simplest thing, the assembled household sleeping, sheltered against the winter night, the same that has comforted the human heart since the first people drawn together in the first shelter against the first cold. The Longhouse holds its sleeping people, warm in the heart of the frozen island, and the night draws on toward its deepest hour. Let us move now, very gently, out into that night, beyond the warm walls, to feel the hard winter world the sleeping hall is set in, before we too turn toward our rest. Step out, in your mind for just a moment, beyond the sleeping hall, into the winter night that holds it. For it is a thing worth feeling, the vast frozen land, the small lit Longhouse is set in, the dead of midwinter night of the north, at its stillest and most immense. and then we will come back into the warmth for good and settle to our own sleep. Beyond the turf walls, the night is enormous and silent and cold, past anything our sheltered lives have known. The snow lies deep and unbroken over the whole island, blue-white under the night sky, smoothing the land into long pale slopes and hollows, burying the walls and the paths and the boundaries of the world, so that the Longhouse sits half drowned in the drifts. A low white mound, with only the faint warmth at its smoke hole to say that anything lives within. The air is utterly still, the way it goes still in the hardest cold. The wind dropped, the snow ceased, the whole frozen island held in a vast unmoving silence. And it is cold? A cold of a depth and a completeness that would kill in an hour anything caught out in it unsheltered. The deep, absolute cold of the northern midwinter night. And the sky, on a clear night, is a wonder such as we almost never see. For there is no light in all that land to dim it, and the stars come out in their countless thousands, sharp and brilliant, and crowding the whole black vault from edge to edge, more than any of us are likely ever to have seen. And there, perhaps, on such a night in the far north, the great lights of the winter sky might come, the shifting curtains and rivers of pale fire that hang and ripple across the northern heavens. The lights that the people of that land knew well, the silent cold fire of the winter sky moving over the snow. The frozen island lies silent under that immense and brilliant and shifting sky. The deep snow, the still air, the crowding stars, the cold pale fire of the heavens, the whole vast frozen night of the north, at its most immense and beautiful and merciless. And in all that great frozen silence, the one living, breathing thing for miles is the Longhouse, the low turf hall half buried in the snow, with its banked fire glowing red within, and its sleeping household gathered snug under the turf. The one small ember of life and warmth in all the enormous frozen dark. There is something that catches at the very heart in that, the small, bright hall full of sleeping life set in the midst of the vast, cold, beautiful, deadly night, the one kept fire to hold off the whole frozen immensity. The assembled household safe in their turf shelter, while the winter night stands silent and brilliant and merciless over the snow. It is the oldest image there is, almost, the warm shelter against the wild night, the kept fire against the winter and the night, and the Longhouse on its frozen island. This Yule night, is that image made real, the small flicker of life held safe at the heart of the deep cold world. Within the household sleeps on, untroubled, deep in the warmth. The beasts breathe slow in the byre, the patient bulk of them quiet in the dark. The banked fire glows its low, steady red down the centre of the hall, holding its heat and its life through the night, warming the sleeping company. The people lie along the benches in their furs and their woolens, the master and the lady, the children, the servants, the assembled household, deep in the sleep that the feast and the heat and the winter have brought them. Breathing slow and even in the dim red glow, safe under the turf, warm in the teeth of the cold, gathered drawn close against the night. Nothing stirs but the slow settling of the embers and the breathing of the sleepers and the beasts. The feast is over, and the hall is at rest, and the long midwinter night holds the sleeping Longhouse in its vast cold silence, and turns, slowly, toward a dawn. Still many hours away, and there is the deep comfort of it. To carry down toward your own sleep, the hall full of sleeping life deep within the frozen night, the kept fire, the household, the turf walls holding the warmth, the cold, beautiful night held off beyond them. The people of the Longhouse have done the oldest and the deepest thing there is, against the longest and the hardest night of the year. They have made warmth and light and plenty and company, and gathered together in it, and held off the dark and the cold and the deep winter night, with fire and feasting and the heat of one another, and now they sleep, safe and fed and full, in the heart of all that frozen immensity, while the wheel of the year turns slowly back toward the light. Let us rest with them a while in that deep peace, the sleeping hall in the frozen night, before we follow the long thread of their age forward down the centuries toward our own time and our own sleep. The life of the Longhouse, the world of the old gods, and the Yule feast and the toasts to Odin and Frey was not to last, and to follow its thread forward, as we always do before we sleep, is to come upon one of the most remarkable turning points in all the northern story. The moment when the old faith gave way to the new, and it happened in Iceland, in a way that tells you everything about this people and their strange devotion to the law. For within a few years of a night like this one, around the very turning of the 1000th year, the new faith, Christianity, came to Iceland, as it was coming to all the northern lands. Carried by missionaries and pressed by the now Christian kings of Norway, and the island was split hard and dangerously between those who held to the old gods and those who had taken the new faith. The two parties stood near to open war, the worshippers of Thor and Odin and Frey on the one side, the Christians on the other, all the country divided, the matter coming, as all great matters in Iceland came, to the Althing, the great assembly, in the summer near the year 1000. And there, faced with a division that might have torn the country apart in blood, the Icelanders did a thing so characteristic of them that it has never been forgotten. They did not fight it out. They put the matter to the law. They agreed, both parties, the heathen and the Christian, to abide by the decision of one man, the law speaker, the keeper of the law, and to take his ruling as binding on the country, whichever way it fell. And the law speaker, the tale goes, a man still himself, a worshipper of the old gods, went apart, and lay down, and covered himself wholly with his cloak, and lay there a day and a night in silence, thinking, while the whole country waited. And then he rose, and uncovered himself, and gave his ruling that to keep the country one, to keep the peace and the law, all Iceland should take the new faith and be baptized, becoming Christian by law. Though with certain old customs allowed to continue quietly for a time, and the country abided by it, the heathen accepted the ruling for the sake of the law and the unity of the land, and Iceland became Christian, not by conquest or by war, but by a decision of its own assembly, abided by even by those it went against, for the keeping of the law and the peace. There is something extraordinary in that, all the country changing its faith by a ruling of its law, the losing party accepting the loss for the sake of the law and the unity of the people. And it is the final proof of how deep the law and the assembly ran in these people, deeper even than the gods. But for the world of the Longhouse, it meant an ending. The old gods, Odin and Thor and Frey, slowly faded from worship, became at last the figures of old story rather than living powers. The old sacrifices ceased, the temples and the holy places fell out of use. The vast vivid world of the northern gods, the world tree and the doom of the gods and the Norns at the well of fate, passed slowly out of belief and into memory, into tale, into the old poems remembered and at last written down. And Yule itself, the great midwinter feast we have been sharing, did not end, but was changed, baptized, drawn into the new faith, for the Christian feast of the birth of Christ fell at just the same season. The midwinter, the turning of the dark. And the new feast was laid down over the old, and took its place, and even kept its old northern name, so that the midwinter feast went on, the gathering and the firelight and the plenty, to set against the longest dark, but turned now to a new meaning and a new God. The Yule of the Longhouse, the feast of Odin and the remembered dead, became, by slow degrees, the Christmas of the later North. But the deep shape of it survived, the feast of heat and brightness, and gathering at the dead of the year, the holding off of the dark by fire and plenty and company, the thing older than either faith. The word itself comes down to us still, in the lands of the North, the old name for the midwinter feast, surviving across 1,000 years, and the changing of the very gods, and when we keep our own midwinter festivals. In the depth of the year, we are doing, under whatever name and whatever faith, the same deep old thing the folk of the Longhouse did on the night we have shared. Gathering warmth and light and company against the longest dark, so the life of the Longhouse passed, the old gods giving way, the old feast transformed, the vivid heathen world sinking into memory and story. But it did not vanish without trace, for these people, almost uniquely among the peoples of their age, left a great record of themselves, written down by their own descendants in the centuries after, and it is to what survives of this age, that we turn now, for the Longhouse and its people are not wholly lost to us, even across 1,000 years. What survives of this life is more than survives of almost any other people of that distant age, and it is one of the wonders of the North. For the descendants of the people in this hall did a thing that few other peoples of their time did. They wrote their world down. In the centuries after the conversion, when the new faith had brought the art of writing in books to the island, the Icelanders turned that art marvellously upon their own past, and set down in writing the great store of tales they had carried so long in memory, the tales of the high gods and the heroes, and above all, the tales of their own ancestors. The settlers and the chieftains and the feuds and the voyages of the early days, the very tales that had been told aloud in halls like this one, on nights like this one. And so we have the sagas, the great prose tales of medieval Iceland, the noblest literature the medieval North produced, the long, spare, powerful stories of the Icelandic families and their deeds and their quarrels and their fates, written down from the old oral memory by the descendants of the people they tell of. And we have the old poems, the verses of the gods and the heroes, the Eddic poems that preserve the whole mythology of the North, the world tree and the doom of gods and of the wisdom of Odin, set down at last in writing before they could be wholly lost. It is from these, from the sagas and the poems written down in Iceland in the medieval centuries, that we know almost everything we know of the old northern world, its gods and its heroes and its values and its daily life, the whole vivid life that would otherwise have vanished utterly. The folk of the hall kept their world alive in the spoken word, in the tales told by the fire, and their descendants caught that spoken world and fixed it in writing just before it faded. And so it comes down to us, across 1,000 years, the voice of the northern hall still speaking. And there is more that survives than the words. There is the land itself, and the earth, and what lies in it. The halls of turf and stone did not last, as the stone keeps of other lands lasted, for turf returns to the earth, and the longhouses fell and slumped and grew over with grass and sank back into the ground from which they were built. But their shapes remain, the low outlines of them under the turf, and the patient work of those who dig into the past has uncovered them. The floors and the long hearths, and the post holes, and the benches of the old halls, and in them the things the people left, the tools and the brooches, and the beads and the bones, the small hard traces of the life that was lived there. The very longhouse we have sat in tonight, or one like it, lies somewhere under the Icelandic turf, its long hearth cold these 1,000 years, its shape still legible in the earth, waiting to be read. And across the wider northern world stand the rune stones. The carved memorial stones the people raised, the runes still cut sharp in them, still speaking the names of the long dead. The memorials that have outlasted by 1,000 years, the hands that raised them, and the people they were raised for. So this world is not wholly lost. Its words come down to us in the sagas and the poems, Its halls lie waiting under the turf, its runestones still stand and speak, and through all of it the people of the Longhouse reach forward down the centuries and touch us, who can still read their tales and walk the outlines of their halls and stand before their carved stones and know them, in part, across all the gulf of time. They wanted, above all things, to be remembered, to leave a name and a story that would outlast them, for that, in their hard creed, was the only life beyond death, and in this they succeeded beyond anything they could have dreamed. For here we are, 1,000 years on, at the far side of the earth from their frozen island, speaking of them still, sitting in their hall in our imagination, remembering them. The memory cup raised to the dead in the firelit hall has been answered across 1,000 years, the names kept, the world remembered, the people of the hall not forgotten. There is a profound and a moving thing in that, the wish to be remembered answered across so vast a span of time, and it is the truest monument of all to these people, that their age, told by their own firesides and written down by their own descendants, lives still. Let us carry that forward now, the long thread of memory reaching from their hall to ours, as we turn back, for the last time, to the warm sleeping Longhouse, and begin to make ready for our own sleep. Let me draw out, before we sleep, the force that lies beneath all the strangeness of this old northern world and binds it close to your own, for it is worth feeling as the night deepens. The deep human thing that the Longhouse and its Yule feast finally are. Beneath the gods and the ships and the runes and the 1,000 years, beneath all that makes this world so far from ours, there is something at the very heart of it that is not far from us at all, that is, in truth, the same as us, for what is the Longhouse in the end, and what is the feast we have shared? It is shelter and warmth and light and company, drawn together against the night and the cold of the deepest winter. It is people, frightened and hopeful as people always are, making a warm, bright, safe place amid the bitter cold dark of the world and gathering into it together, and holding off the night with fire and plenty and the heat of one another. And that, stripped of all its strangeness, is the oldest and the deepest and the most human of all there is. The thing we have all done since the very beginning, the making of warmth and brightness and shelter from the dark, the gathering of our own close around us, the holding off of the cold, and the night by fire and food and company and love. We do it still, every one of us, in our own ways, in the dead of our own winters. We make our homes warm and bright through the cold. We gather our families and our friends close at the turn of the year, in the midwinter, and we feast and we light our lights against the longest nights, and we remember the ones we have lost, and we hold off the dark for a while with warmth and gathering and plenty, exactly as the household did 1,000 years ago on their frozen island. The gods have changed, and the ships are gone, and the turf halls have sunk back into the earth, but the deep thing, the warmth that holds off the dark, the gathering at the heart of the night, the feast at the year's turning, that has not changed at all, and it binds us to these people across all the centuries more truly than all the strangeness divides us. And that is why the Longhouse, for all its strangeness and its hardness, can be a place of such deep peace to rest your mind in on a night like this. Because what these people were doing on the night we have shared is the very thing that comforts the human heart most deeply of all. The making of a warm, safe, bright, gathered shelter against the cold and the dark. And when you rest your mind in their hall, you are resting it in the oldest comfort there is, the comfort and the firelight and the company against the winter night. You are doing, in your imagination, the same thing they did, the same people have always done, taking shelter in the bright refuge against the dark, gathering into the warmth, letting the cold and the dark be held off beyond the walls. And tonight, in that imagination, you are not merely watching them do it. You are among them, one of the household, given your place on the bench by the sacred welcome, folded into the glow of the hall for the night. Sheltered with them through the great winter dark, there is nothing to fear and nothing to do. The fire is banked and warm, the turf walls hold off the cold, the household sleeps gathered all around you, the great frozen night is held off beyond the walls, and you, like all the rest, may let go of every wakefulness and sink down into the deep, safe sleep of the sheltered at the centre of the longhouse. Deep in the winter, in the oldest refuge there is, let that old deep comfort settle over you, the gathered shelter against the dark, as we make ready now to take our own seat among the sleeping household and let the night carry us down. So let us take our rest now among the sleeping household, for you have been the guest of the hall all the evening, welcomed by the sacred law of the north, fed at the feast and warmed at the fire. And now, as the household beds down along the benches, there is a place for you among them, a seat on the bench by the warm banked fire, and it is time to take it and to settle and to give yourself over to the sleep of the longhouse. Imagine it then, the finding of your place along the bench, in the warm, dim glow of the banked fire, among the settling household. The bench is broad and firm beneath you, and there is bedding upon it, the woolens and the furs and the soft heaped skins that the household sleeps in through the winter, and you draw them up and around you. The deep, heavy weight of the furs, the softness of the wool, making your nest of warmth along the bench as the household makes theirs all around you. The fire glows low and red and steady down the centre of the hall, its warmth reaching you where you lie, its dim light soft on the dark roof above and the sleeping shapes along the benches. The turf walls rise thick and close around you, holding the warmth in and the bitter cold out, and the household settles all about you, the soft sounds of them bedding down, the rustle of the furs, the low last murmurs, the breathing slowing and deepening as one by one they sink towards sleep. Feel how safe it is, how held, the place on the bench in the very heart of the sleeping hall. You are deep within the longhouse now, wrapped in furs and wool, the banked fire warm beside you, the thick turf walls around you, the whole household gathered close on every side, the beasts breathing slow in the byre, and beyond it all the hard winter night held off. Far off, beyond the walls, there is no safer or warmer or more gathered place in all that frozen land than this. The bench by the banked fire in the sleeping hall, and it is yours for the night, your place among the household, your share of the comfort and the shelter, given freely by the welcome of the hall. And there is nothing left now that you need to do. The feast is over, the tales are told, the toasts are drunk. To the gods and to the remembered dead. The oaths are sworn, the fire is banked, the household is bedding down all around you, into the heat and the sleep. The long midwinter night is at its deepest, and the wheel of the year, even now, is turning back toward the light, though the dawn is hours and hours away. There is nothing you need to keep watch for, and nothing to fear, and nowhere at all to be but here, on the bench, at the heart of the sleeping longhouse, folded into the warmth and the shelter and the company of the hall, with the whole frozen night held off beyond the turf walls. So let your body grow heavy now, on the warm bench, under the deep, soft furs. Let the glow of the low fire and the household soak into you. Let the weight of the long day and the evening sink away. You are warm and you are safe, and you are held deep within the longhouse on the night of the great feast, 1,000 years ago and tonight. And there is nothing left to do but let go the whole rest of the way and sink down into the deep sleep of the sheltered hall. Let us make that last descent together now, gently, sense by sense, into the comfort and the night and the good sleep that is waiting for you. So let everything grow quiet now, and let us go down, the last of the way, into sleep, releasing the world sense by sense. Here on the bench in the heart of the sleeping hall, let your body settle first, all of its weight, down into the bench and the heaped furs, every part of you growing heavy and loose and still. Feel the weight of your limbs, the ease going through them, the long day and the evening draining away out of your muscles, your shoulders loosening, your hands unclasping, your whole body sinking down into the bedding, held and supported and warm, with nothing to hold up and nothing to do, and nowhere to be but here, sinking gently down into rest. Let the warmth fold over you, the good heat of the banked fire, reaching you where you lie. The heat of the furs heaped soft upon you, the warmth of the whole sleeping household drawn close on every side, the warmth held in by the thick turf walls. You are warm all through now, the cold of the hard winter, shut far out beyond the walls, the heat of the fire and the furs and the gathered company soaking into you, easing you, loosening you, carrying you down. There is no cold here, and no fear, only the deep enfolding warmth of the sheltered hall, holding you as you sink toward sleep. Let the sounds grow distant and low. The voices are long stilled now, the household sleeping all around you, and there is almost nothing left to hear. Only the faint settling of the embers in the hearth fire, the slow deep breathing of the sleepers along the benches, the quiet breathing of the beasts, the smallest sounds of the sleeping hall, growing fainter and softer and further away as you sink down beneath them, the gentle sounds of the resting household fading into the quiet of the night. Let the light fade. The lamps are out, and the fire is banked low to its embers, and the hall is dim and red and low, the faint glow of the banked fire, the only light, warm and low and steady. Easy on your closing eyes. Let your eyes grow heavy and close, and let even that soft red glow fade away into the gentle dark behind your eyes, the gentle dark of sleep coming down, nothing left to see, nothing left to watch. Only the warm dark folding over you as you sink down past the last of the light. And let the smell of the hall fade too, the wood smoke and the soft wool and the dying embers and the faint animal warmth, the final homely sense of the sheltered hall growing faint as you go down. The warm familiar smell of the longhouse, the final thread of the waking world, loosening, falling away. One by one the senses are letting go, the sight and the sound and the smell and the touch of the world, releasing you, setting you free to sink down into the deep. And there is nothing now to keep you, nothing to hold, nothing to do but let go the rest of the way. The bench holds you, the furs cover you, the banked fire glows low and steady, the household sleeps all around you, the winter night stands silent beyond the turf walls. And the wheel of the year turns slowly toward the light, and you are sinking, held and safe, down past the last of your waking, into the good sleep of the sheltered hall. Let yourself go all the way down now, gently, into the warmth and the quiet and the deep. And as you drift now down at the soft edge of sleep, let the hall itself begin to loosen and dissolve around you. The way the waking world dissolves as we slip beneath it, the firm shapes of things going low and far and dim, the bench, the furs, the low red glow, the sleeping household, all of it growing distant and gentle and unimportant. Fading at the edges, letting you go, you need hold on to none of it. You need not keep the hall in your mind, nor the fire, nor the feast, nor any of the evening we have shared. Let it all drift away, as you go down the way a warm tide carries you out, easily, without effort. All the world we have built tonight, loosening its hold and floating off into the dim, leaving you free, weightless, sinking gently into the deep quiet where there is nothing at all but rest. And far off, beyond the walls, the winter night is wheeling slowly on toward a dawn, still many hours away. The stars turn over the snow, The cold, pale fire of the northern lights hangs and fades across the sky. And though it is still the depth of the night, the wheel of the year has turned its lowest point and is climbing by the smallest degrees back toward the light. The sun that has sunk so low beginning, even now its long, slow return. The days that will lengthen, the light that will come back, the spring that waits, far off and certain, beyond the long winter. The feast was held at the very bottom of the dark, and from the bottom of the dark there is only one way, and that is up toward the returning light. And the people sleeping in the hall sleep in that quiet promise. The worst of the dark behind them now, the light beginning, slowly, slowly, to come back to the world. There is the deepest comfort of all in that, to carry down into your sleep, that the night is turning, that the light is coming back, that even at the very bottom of the longest night, the wheel is climbing again toward the sun. The household sleeps in the warm hall, safe through the worst of the winter, and the year is turning, and the glow is returning, and all is as it should be, and nothing remains to do but rest, and trust the turning, and sleep. The hall is warm, the fire is kept, the household is safe, the night is wheeling on toward the dawn, and you are held deep in the heart of it all, safe and held and let go. Drifting now in the stillness, where the longhouse and the winter and the whole turning world have softened away into nothing, into rest, into the good sleep that has been waiting for you all along. Sink the last little way into it now. There is nothing left to do but sleep. There is nothing now but the warmth and the quiet and the slow breathing of the sleeping hall. And you among them, deep in your place on the bench. Let go of all of the day. Each breath you take is slower than the one before. Each breath carries you a little further down, a little further into the warm and the soft and the still, a little further from the waking world and its weight. There is nothing to hold, there is nothing to carry. The fire is kept, and you need not tend it. The household is gathered safe, and you need not watch over them. The winter night stands guard beyond the turf walls, and it asks nothing of you but that you rest. You have your place among the people of the hall, given freely, and your share of the warmth, and your part in the deep old shelter against the dark, and all of it holds you now without the least effort of your own. The way the warm bench holds your resting body, the way the furs hold your warmth, the way the sleeping household holds you in its midst. So let the last of your waking loosen and go, let your thoughts, if any are left, grow slow and dim and far, drifting like the last blue smoke under the roof, thinning, fading, gone. There is no thought you need to finish, no worry you need to hold, no corner of the day you need to keep watch over any longer. Let them all go soft and loosen and drift away into the soft glowing dark. The way the household around you has already let go of everything and given itself wholly to sleep. Let the warm dark take you all the way down, gently, with no edge and no end, into the deep good sleep of the longhouse, the same sleep the household sleeps around you, deep and sheltered and safe, deep in the winter, while the immense night wheels slowly on toward a far-off dawn. You are warm, you are held, you are exactly where you need to be. And there is nothing left in all the world to do but breathe and rest and sink the last gentle way into sleep. If you are still with me at all, drifting there at the soft edge of sleep, let me say a few last quiet words, and then I will leave you to your rest. Thank you for spending these few hours with me, here in the warm heart of the Longhouse, on the night of the midwinter feast 1,000 years ago. We have shared a long evening together, you and I. The fire and the feast and the tales and the toasts, the gods and the dead and the long sea roads and the whole slow settling of the hall towards sleep. And it has been good to keep you company through it. Wherever you are listening from, in whatever far place and whatever late hour, I hope the glow of that old hall has reached you, and that you feel as sheltered tonight as the household gathered safe against the winter. If these long journeys into vanished worlds are a comfort to you, and you would like more of them to find their way to you on the nights you need them, then you might gently subscribe, so that the next one can reach you when it comes. That is all. You have your place on the bench, and the fire is kept, and the night will look after itself. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.